Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Lacy, by the Silvery Moonlight, by bearLair64. By the light of the silvery moon, I want to croon to my honey about who loves whom. Sorry, Bear, that's all you get singing. I finished the old tune and stared down lovingly into Lacy's wide brown eyes. She gave me a big smile and wiggled in delight. We both enjoyed the early summer evening on the front porch, indeed by the light of the silvery moon. I stroked her back and cuddled her close. In so short a time she'd become a true delight in my life. Dogs have a way of doing that. Oh, you thought she was a woman or a girl? Well, that's okay. So did she. Her life had been hard up to the point when the folks at the local animal shelter had ended up with her. She was a medium to large mixed breed, plenty of golden retriever in that mix by the look of her, and trending towards the larger end of the scale. A little russet in the coat and a slightly pointed nose, maybe some Irish setter. She was still young enough to be a little fuzzball, but was starting to look like a real dog, a grown-up. Okay, an adolescent. She had plenty of energy and was clearly very bright. It hadn't taken long to house-train her, and she could already sit and stay. She was kind enough to tolerate me singing old songs as we puttered about my place and wasted time. The life of the newly retired. I loved animals, but hadn't wanted any when I retired. I felt like I'd be traveling or working on projects, and wouldn't have time to properly care for one. Then I stopped by the shelter to visit and ogle Ms. Wanda Jameson. We'd met elsewhere, but she told me where she worked and invited me to visit. Next thing I knew, I had Lacy and a complete setup for a new pup, and Wanda trundled me out to my truck without so much as a by your leave, here's my number, or kiss my foot. Women. But my Lacy was loyal. A scratch on the rump, just above the tail, and another behind the ears, and she was mine for the day. Okay, at least for the moment. Pooches sometimes have short memories. I hadn't realized until Lacy arrived, and I had started to share my home with another living being, just how lonely I'd become. Sure, I had my fun with the old gals around town, but I hadn't looked at any of them seriously. My wife had died many years previously. We'd had no children, and without her, well, life could be empty at times. She was still the other half of my internal dialogue. Now I had a sweet little lady to take on walks, one who wouldn't fuss at me or argue when I griped about politics, and one who liked me singing old songs as much as my Rhonda had. Life with Lacy was good. That moon sure was bright. It was full. Gibbous, as folks used to say. Bright enough that I decided that we could take a walk through the yard, let my little critter relax and enjoy the great outdoors before we headed inside for bed. Not like we had to get up and do anything. Lacy sniffed and gambled and rooted her nose under every bush and tree with the tirelessness of youth. I envied her for a moment. Then she started getting close to the woods near the edge of the property. We had paper company-owned forests on both sides. They extended for miles. Never knew what might be lurking under those branches. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. Didn't want my girl to encounter a copperhead or other nasty concealed in the moon shadows. I called to her, "Lacy, come back here." "Good girl, come on." Naturally, she decided she didn't want to be a good girl, or maybe she was just too excited by the things she smelled, so she kept at it for a moment, then abruptly halted in her tracks. She looked up and out into the forest and gave a little huff. Not a bark, just a startled, defensive sound. She started for another moment, then bolted towards the trees. "Lacy!" I called in vain. "Get back here!" I was suddenly afraid. What if she'd taken off after a coyote or a wild dog, or worse yet, a feral hog? Those things were dangerous to full-grown dogs. Lacy was still a pup. I hadn't planned on the walk, so I didn't have a flashlight or a walking stick, and had nothing on my feet but flip-flops. But I ran after her, heedless of what was sure to happen to my feet on the rough forest floor. Then I heard her yelp. The sound was engulfed by a deep-throated growl. Not Lacy's. It was a yelp of pain and fear, and she wasn't too far ahead. I heard the sound of rustling brush as some large animal or person fled from the same direction. Far more noise than little Lacy could produce. I found her lying in the roots of an old oak tree, her fur stained with blood, her ribs pumped with heavy breaths, and a slight whimper and whine emanated from her throat. Something large had bitten her along the scruff of her neck and had maybe shaken her. It had to be large. She was nearly 40 pounds. It might have even been a cougar. I was nervous, but otherwise I set aside my major fears and scooped up my little girl and carried her back home. As I hobbled through the last of the trees before my yard, I was startled by the sound of a low-octave howl that rang out through the woods. The challenge of a predator, triumphant over a fresh kill. Maybe Miss Lacy had interfered in the hunt. In any case, some poor creature had just met its end. I got her inside the house and under some clear lighting and examined her. The wounds did not appear to be deep or near anything but vital, but they were already swollen and I could see irritation around each puncture. She'd gone limp and nearly lifeless. Her breathing now slow, like she was in a deep sleep. I wrapped her in a towel and carried her out to the car. I drove the several miles into town and to the veterinarian's office. She lived behind the clinic, and I knew she would take on an emergency case. In our area, those were sick livestock as often as household pets. Poor Dr. Stone had just gone to bed, but she gamely answered my knocks and rings. She escorted Lacy and me to the clinic, and once we were inside, she immediately went to work on the now decidedly limp dog. She shooed me out into the front area and ordered me to make some coffee, since I'd made her get out of bed. I complied and allowed her to do her work. When I looked back in on them, she was putting in some stitches and wore a worried frown. That made me worry. It was a long night. The next morning I was awakened from where I'd stretched out on the sofa in the waiting area by Lacy nosing at me. When I was mostly alert, she gave me her usual effulgent dog smile. I could not understand how such a sweet creature managed to have such hideous breath. Despite my relief and sheer joy, it took me a few minutes to sit up and get my joints to move properly. Well, as properly as they did these days. There she was, perky and goofy as ever, wagging her butt to counter her tail. A new, fragrant face lick got me fully alert and on my feet. Ugh! Gross! I grouched playfully as I attempted to wave away the foul smell. When the doc arrived, I settled the bill with her and thanked her profusely. She seemed surprised that Lacy appeared to be doing so well. I must admit I was worried for her last night. I expected to have her here for a few days, but the punctures look, well, significantly healed. Far more than they should be. She's had her shots, but you'll need to keep an eye on her. No interactions with other animals. She's quarantined for potential rabies exposure. Just a precaution, but please watch her. Oh, and give her these twice a day. Antibiotics. Don't want her getting any nasty infections. As she said the last, she gave Lacy a quick back rub and was rewarded with a wet dog kiss. "Oh, we need to get her in for a teeth cleaning. She's too young to have such awful breath," Dr. Stone exclaimed. So we backed up and headed back to our shanty in the woods. I stopped by the little grocery store in town on the way and picked up some treats for both Lacy and me. We'd had a long night. When we arrived, Lacy hopped out of the truck through the driver's side as usual, too anxious to wait for me to open her side. Yet once she'd bounded out into the yard, she stopped. She tensed and then cowered. Next thing I knew, she was glued to my side. She stayed that way until we got inside. She'd cast nervous glances at the woods as we proceeded across the yard. She definitely remembered what had happened inside the trees. That evening, I gave her the antibiotic pill, just before her supper dish. She took it fine and allowed me to inspect her wounds. I was astonished. They had healed and left 4 perfect pink puncture scars, as though they were a couple of weeks old. I rubbed the area, and she didn't seem to feel any pain. She just grinned at me and puffed her foul breath my way. We'd definitely have to visit the doc again for that teeth cleaning. I decided to wait until tomorrow to call for an appointment. I was glad that the wounds were better, but it was weird, and I thought I'd better keep the doc in the loop. I called Dr. Stone's office, and she had an opening the next hour, so I got ready and escorted Lacy back to the truck. She kept eyeing the trees warily and stayed on my leg. She stopped to have a pee. She had been holding it for a while. Apparently, she no longer wished to enter the yard alone. Maybe we'd have to fix that. I couldn't run outside to pee every time she did. Well, if my prostate kept growing, maybe. "Well, Miss Lacy, you seem to be a miracle healer. Is that your true breed?" Miriam Stone spoke engagingly to my pup, who responded with a huff of breath and a goofy grin. "Ugh, we need to clean those teeth ASAP. I have an opening for that Thursday afternoon. Can you bring her?" She glanced over her shoulder at me. I nodded. "Sure, Doc. Let me just check my appointment book." I mimicked flipping through the pages and running down the lines of an imaginary book. "Looks like we're clear. I'm retired, and Lacy hasn't decided what she wants to be when she grows up. She's currently in homeschool." Lacy perked up a little when she heard her name. Over the next few days, Lacy seemed to get much stronger and even fill out some. "Doggy growth spurt, apparently," I thought as I watched her sniff around the yard after she did her business. She was still nervous about going far from the house by herself, but she was starting to recover her confidence. I was sure she'd be racing around her territory once more. Her teeth cleaning had been pretty routine. Her breath still reeked, though. The stinkometer readings were much lower. Some dogs just had nasty breath, like some people. I noticed that she preferred the side of the house farthest from the forest of late. She'd occasionally stop, peek around the corner of the house, and sniff the air from the direction of the shadows cast by the great boles and limbs. She was doing that as I watched her. Then came an ear-splitting howl from inside the line, where the shadows were deep and obscured the exact source of the sound. Lacy immediately cowered and then bolted towards the back door to the house. She burst through her doggy door before I could even rise to my feet. There was still some light this evening, and after my rapid beating pulse settled, I followed her into the house. It was time to check out what creature was lurking out there, haunting my home and my one true friend. I went inside and found my poor dog on the couch, burrowed beneath her favorite blanket, shivering with fear rather than cold. I pat where the lump of her back rose slightly under the material. She growled and snapped at me. Fortunately, her head was covered, so she didn't make contact. I drew back my hand, startled, and then realized just how scared she was. had frightened her. I walked over to the hall closet and picked up my 12-gauge. I checked the load and walked back out onto the back porch. I stepped off and headed in the direction from which I heard the howl. I intended to put a stop to whatever beast was hiding out there, menacing my home, frightening my little girl. This time I wore boots, and I was ready to traipse through the brush. I was well armed, and my blood was up enough to stave off the pain from my back and knees, the constant pain from which Lacy distracted me so well. Now it faded into the background, and I was on the hunt. I slowed once. I was through the brush and under the trees. I began to walk quietly, placing the balls of my feet before me. I stopped frequently to listen. There were no sounds. It was eerie. No birds, no rustles, not even the buzzing of insects. I took a whiff when a slight breeze blew through the branches. I retched and bent forward, preparing to give up my lunch. The stench was horribly foul. Death, rot, musk, and something less definable, but similar to a street person who hasn't been able to wash for a few weeks, all combined with wet dog. When I'd recovered from the initial shock of the wretched stench, I looked up towards the source of the odor, and through the leaves and branches of a yelpin, I saw the eyes. Red eyes. Not reflective, but glowing with the inner light of a nighttime predator. They were set higher off the ground than mine, definitely higher than any normal animal. I thought, maybe it's a person in a costume, or using a prop to play some sort of prank? Yet I couldn't shake an overwhelming sense of dread. The features were sharp, a long nose that descended from between luminous eyes, heavy brows or fur around the eyes, like a cap or long messy hair. I strained my eyes to look more closely, yet the rest of the body was stood frozen in place. The figure shifted slightly, as if it read my thoughts, that I wanted, no, I needed a better look. The head lowered, and I saw that it had pointed ears that protruded from either side of its head and swept backwards. Then I saw the mouth, the maw of the monster. It gaped open to display sharply tipped teeth and fangs and seemed to wear a wicked grin, full of malevolence. I shook with fear, but eventually recalled that I held the shotgun. I blinked away my locked, tunneled gaze and raised the stock to my shoulder. As I tucked the butt into my shoulder, in the pocket, I saw that there was nothing ahead of me, nothing hiding behind the yapon. It had gotten even darker while the creature and I had stood eyeing one another in challenge and fear respectively. I heard some rustles out in the woods. The smell dissipated. The sound of other creatures returned as though they'd been muted, and then the audio had been switched on again. I backed a few steps, then turned and quickly made my way back to my yard, to the safety of my property, to my girl, Lacy. As I left behind the last of the trees, I saw that more time had passed than I'd realized. It was nearing full-on dark. I felt the need to get into the shelter of my house, so I picked up the pace again, my niece screaming at the effort. As I reached the porch, the howl bellowed forth once more. Once more, just inside the line of trees, the vomit-inducing stench assailed my olfactory senses once more. I scrambled inside, and there was Lacy. She faced the now-closed door, and her best friend, who leaned back against it as though it could stop that thing outside. She lowered her head and growled fiercely, not at all like anything I'd ever heard from her. I soon realized that she did not growl at me, but at whatever was treading on the floorboards of my porch. I stepped away from the door and faced the front windows. all the while shifting the barrel between them, trying to follow the tread of an obviously heavy animal, person, being. I had no idea, but was adamantly sure that I didn't want to know. The screech of razor talons scratched the wood on my front door, sounded, and Lacy let out a bark. The sound caused me to flinch, and against all my years of practice in keeping my finger off the trigger until I was ready to fire, I fired. The boom startled me even more than the bark at the butt of the 12-gauge slammed into my shoulder, and my ears instantly filled and began to ring. The stench of cordite rose from the chamber and the end of the barrel, and for a brief instant overrode the foulness of the monster, as I instinctively used my grip on the forestock to eject the first round and shove it forward to load the next. The first round had been buckshot, and now I had a nice fat hole just above and to the left of the doorknob, where I'd been hovering the barrel. There was a scream of agony and surprise from the front porch, a deep, coarse sound that hinted of rage-filled pain. Lacy growled and barked, and I could just hear her as my poor damaged ears continued to ring. When did I take off the safety? My mind wondered. The question was irrelevant, but under pressure the mind wanders in many directions at once. As all of these events concurred almost at once, my perceptions were somewhat overwhelmed. Before I had a chance to sort through all of the rubbish of my synapses, the door burst inward, shards of wood and spalls of glass flying haphazardly towards us. I stumbled backwards and all but fell as the huge fur and hair-covered monstrosity raged into my home in a snarling fit of rage. I'd pulled up the muzzle of the shotgun and tucked my face into the crook of my elbow to protect my eyes. Before I could recover enough to get the barrel back online, the beast was upon me. It swatted aside the barrel and its claws raked my arm. Then it raised its other hand to shred me. Before the frightening swift beast could strike again, a reddish-blonde streak shoved past my left shoulder and slammed into the thing's chest. Lacy! Yet it couldn't be Lacy. This animal was much larger and more muscular. The front legs had elongated, and the paws had morphed into clawed hands. The larger home invader gripped Lacy and flung her across the room. She impacted the wall farthest from the front door and slumped onto the floor. I was instantly furious and pulled the buttstock into the center of my chest and fired my next round into the monster's chest, just below the throat. Its response barely registered as I pumped in another round and fired, then another, and then the fifth and final round. These 4 had been rifled slugs. The bipedal big bad werewolf lay sprawled backwards on the floor, its upper body resting on my favorite rocking chair, and bleeding on an afghan my wife had knitted for me. Bastard! Lacy was on it in a moment. Apparently she'd recovered from the stunning wall slam almost immediately. She had the thing supine and was dragging it across the floor towards the front door, her jaws clamped on top of its right shoulder at the neck, and her head worked side to side. When she realized it was no longer alive, she released it. To my astonishment, she drew up onto her hind legs. Her shoulders and chest had become relatively massive. She threw back her head and howled. The roar overcame even the tinnitus from the sound of the 12-gauge rounds. It was the same I'd heard from the woodline, the same as from the now dead fiend lying inside my front door. She slowly lowered her head and looked towards me. She wore a sinister grin that quickly turned to embarrassment. She looked down, clearly abashed, and then sprung through what was left of the front door of our home and ran into the darkness. once again on all fours. I was in too much shock to even shout after her. At that point, I wasn't sure that I wanted her to come back inside. Then the awful odor rose from the carcass in front of me. The creature seemed to melt. The features morphed and collapsed until there was a dead, naked woman stretched out before me. Her hair was long and stringy and dirty. She was hairy from head to toe and filthy. A pile of putrid fur and flesh outlined her corpse. The mass looked like a large dog roadkill that had been run over several times and left to sit in the hot sun for a few days. It smelt like it, too. I realized as I leaned forward and vomited onto the body, adding my own stink. How am I going to explain this? I asked myself as I awaited the deputies. After I'd recovered from the initial shock, I realized that I had a set of claw marks on my left arm and forearm. I'd set the shotgun aside. Definitely didn't want to have that in my hand when rural sheriff's deputies responded to a homicide. It went better, if more strangely than I'd anticipated. I met the deputies outside and pointed toward the dead woman thing. The foulness had driven me out into the fresh night air. I warned the two as they drew their sidearms and stalked into my house. They didn't pay attention, and both quickly fled back out onto the porch, one of them leaning over the far rail to lose his supper. Sorry, dude, I tried to warn you, I thought uncharitably. Eventually they recovered and cleared my home, and I took one statement while the other called in the ambulance crew and used his phone to call their boss. It was going to be another long night. The lead EMS employee looked at my scratches. She let the deputies take a few photos and then bandaged them. Around the gouges, the skin showed definite signs of irritation. Sir, you can drive yourself or we can take you, but you really need to have an ER doc look at them. She glanced at the SO lieutenant to confirm that I would be free to seek treatment. He nodded and stepped forward. Mr. Brooks, Sheriff Scogan and the Justice of the Peace are on the way. Do you think you could wait until they officially clear the scene before you seek treatment? I agreed. The paramedic looked at the lieutenant and then shrugged. Your call, sir. But please, you really need to see someone soon. There will definitely be infection. In fact, I believe there already is. Don't see many that take hold so rapidly. The sheriff himself arrived within a few minutes, with the Justice of the Peace in tow. There was no county coroner or medical examiner in this rural corner of the county. The JP would be there to make a death ruling. Pretty easy. In the time since the deputies arrived, more of the flesh had fallen from the woman's body. No one could or would go near the reeking mass any more than necessary, but when the sheriff and JP viewed the pictures that the first arriving units had taken, they both looked shocked. They looked at each other in silent communication, and then at me. Sheriff Cloud spoke first. Mr. Brooks, just how did you know the lady in question? I peered at him, a little puzzled. Know her? The first time I saw her, she was hiding out in the woods wearing some kind of costume like a werewolf. Next time she burst through my front door and raked me with her talons. He grunted slightly. Was there anyone else here? Anyone who may corroborate your story? I shrugged. Just my dog, Lacy, but she ran off into the trees, likely in fear of the shotgun rounds. She bit that woman, dragged her from where she fell, I added hesitantly. The sheriff glanced at the JP, who nodded her approval. Look, this is clearly a homicide. He quickly raised his hands. Not a murder. Homicide just means that one person killed another. The means and motive provide the category of the homicide and determine whether there was a crime. She clearly burst through your door, and your wounds are obviously defensive. From an investigative standpoint, the DNA will have to corroborate, but at this time it's my call that this was self-defense, and we won't be seeking any criminal charges. He paused and took a breath. Are you familiar with, or have you ever heard the name, Lacy Elbert? I started at the name and quickly explained. Lacy's my dog's name. I picked her up at the shelter in town, about a month ago. I don't recall hearing the name Elbert at all. Oh, wait, I think there's a local family by that name, or maybe I read it in the local... Oh, yeah, that's it. There was a story on the hometown news site. Something about her missing, or... No, you were looking for her. She was wanted? Some kind of assault or murder? You mean that's her? The same woman? The pair of public officials paused, and then in unison, like a pair of bobblehead dolls, nodded. The JP took a turn. We believe that Lacy may have been responsible for killing her parents and boyfriend, and possibly some others. We have we have some evidence to that effect, though we're not really at liberty to discuss it at this time. From your standpoint, I think it's safe to say that you are unlikely to face charges. We still have to complete an investigation, and of course the DA's office will have to review. I barely heard the rest in my rush of relief. It was indeed a long night, and the sun was up before the first final responders left my property. They'd already processed the scene, and just as the first rays of the sun broke the horizon, they carted off the now putrid mass of gunk and bones. The stench was reduced a little. The crime scene team had applied some solutions to the affected area to prevent contamination. That odd, rapid deterioration made it clear that there was something different about this case. I really wanted a shower and a nap before I drove to the ER. I thought that maybe I can get an appointment with my regular doc instead. Then I saw her. My pup, my Lacy, hobbled tiredly from the tree line and towards the house. We would both need a bath. She was filthy, but she looked like her old self, and she perked up a little and gave me a goofy smile as she trotted to my side. Oh, she reeked! I was too tired to make her a bath, so I coaxed her over to the garden hose and washed off most of the gunk. As I rubbed her as clean as I could without shampoo, I noted that she'd developed some serious musculature, and I was sure that she had grown. What crap happening with my dog? I thought worriedly. Once the major chunks were left behind in the yard, and Lacy had a good shake, we went into the house and I took a shower. She was clingy, so I let her join me in the walk-in enclosure, and we both scrubbed with shampoo. I knew she'd make a mess when she got out and shook, but I didn't want her on the furniture or carpet until the dirt and stink were gone. As I bent down to scrub her, she turned and spewed her dragon breath into my face. So much for the too expensive teeth cleaning. Once we were both clean and as dry as we could be, I called my doc and got in the last appointment of the day at 2 p.m. I set the alarm on my phone and then literally crashed into bed. My last thought was that I would need to rent a carpet cleaner. Scratch that. I'd need to get rid of the rug by the front door. Oh, wait. The crime scene tech had taken that for evidence. My last sensation was Lacy snuggling in beside me. She felt warmer than usual, almost like she had a fever. I was running through the forest. My breath was ragged and I was panting. My tongue lolled out of the side of my mouth and drool dripped onto the pine straw below. I looked downward and saw paws. I had paws, and then I smelled something. Normally I would have gagged at the odor, but now it smelled intriguing, even enticing. I ran towards the delectable smell, the smell of blood, the smell of food. I burst through a strand of brush and into a small clearing in a cattle pond. I recognized it. Lacy and I had found it not far into the woods and near an abandoned property next to ours. The carcass of some unfortunate animal lay on the edge of the clearing next to the water. A pair of turkey vultures gnawed at some delectable pieces, but fled when I appeared, all the while issuing a deep growl from deep in my throat. I stalked over to the pond and checked my reflection in the still water to see what I already knew to be. As I lowered my head over the water, I saw pointed ears that swept back above a furry face. And then the alarm sounded. It was time to get up, get dressed, and go see Dr. Castillo. My wounds felt hot and swollen, but I figured it would be best to wait for the doctor to remove the bandages. I didn't check, but I was sure I had a fever. As I passed through the front entrance to my house, no door left, I had to stop and lean over the railing and gag and dry heave for a moment from the rancid stench of death and rot, masked only slightly by a chemical odor. Lacy had accompanied me onto the porch. Not like I could stop her, but I didn't think my doc would like for her to go inside, and I didn't want to leave her in the truck. So I convinced her to go back inside and wait. "It's okay, girl. I'm just going to the next town over. Big city in this part of the world. After I see old grouchy Roberto, I'm sure I'll have to go by the pharmacy. I'll get you some of the treats you like." She listened to me intensely, as though she genuinely understood the words I spoke, not in the silly way dogs seem to understand. She actually grinned and nodded. Then she turned on her heels and walked back inside the house. Apparently the foul odor near the front entrance didn't bother her as she planted her behind on the floor, where the rug and the body had rested. She struck up the doggy seated at the front door, waited patiently pose, and drooled onto the floor a little. I left what was left of the front door ajar. I thought of hanging a sheet or some plastic over it, but I wanted the air to circulate and move more of the stink, and, too, I felt awful. I didn't feel like driving the nearly 40 miles to see my doctor, much less making home repairs, but it was clearly becoming critical. I managed to make it to not only the doctor's office, but inside. I'd only seen Dr. Castillo twice before, so we were still new to each other. Still, he took one look and asked, "Why didn't you go to the emergency room? I'm happy to take care of you, but this should not have waited." "Doc," I was exhausted and sleepy like I've rarely ever been. "That crazy woman who attacked me, I'm sure she had plenty of unsavory substances beneath her claw nails. As it is, I barely managed to make it to your office." He nodded. "Yep. Typical hard-headed old man. Much like me." He chuckled a little. "You know, you have a higher fever than should be the case with such a recent infection. And yes, the wounds are infected. We will need to—" A roaring noise supplanted his voice in my ears, and my vision shrank into a long gray tunnel, and then into the dark cave of unconsciousness. Well, eventually I either had to die or regain my senses. Apparently, I'd accomplished the latter when my eyes fluttered open, and after a moment of gummy blur, I made out the face of a nurse and the bland, basic tones of a hospital room. "So how are we feeling, Mr. Brooks? Any better?" I know I must have looked confused. Could she not tell that I was confused? What was wrong with her? She'd been intelligent enough to pass her RN program, but why am I so angry? I wondered. Not like me to be angry at anyone for no real reason. Apparently she took my stupid, grouchy look to mean that I had no clue which I didn't. Sir, you lost consciousness in Dr. Castillo's office. He brought you over here to the emergency room. That was a few hours ago. You have infected wounds and a fever. Is there anyone you'd like us to call for you?" My throat was as dry as a Mojave, but I managed to croak out, "No, I live alone. Oh, wait. My dog, Lacy. Not sure whom to call." I realized I was in one of those awful hospital gowns. "Where's my phone? For that matter, where's my pants?" We eventually sorted out my belongings and clothing. Dr. Castillo had admitted me for an overnight stay for observation. Dr. Stone, meanwhile, had decided that she'd take a house call, collect Lacy, and keep her at the clinic overnight. She also contacted the sheriff's office and get them to check on the house overnight. What a sweet lady, I thought as I clicked off my phone. She texted me back before long and told me that she'd been unable to locate Lacy. She had looked and called but couldn't find her, so she set out some food and water and would wait another hour. I sent back that in addition to paying her fee that I'd like to take her out to dinner when I was back on my feet. I was surprised when she quickly responded that she'd like that. Lacy didn't show, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. No dreams this time. I was cleared to go home the next morning. My fever had dissipated, and my welts looked to become an impressive set of scars about which I could tell lies. Brag. I was still weak, but I felt up to driving. I was worried about Lacy, and I couldn't believe that I'd asked Dr. Stone on a date. Wait, I equivocated internally. Just dinner. I stopped at the pharmacy for my new prescription of Cipro and some pain meds that I'd try to avoid taking. I kept my promise and picked up a box of Lacy's favorite treats. Hopefully she'll have returned, likely just out exploring. I drove up towards the side of the house, and there she was, sitting on the front porch, tail pounding, all fear from the past days apparently wiped from her short memory. She looked different. Her fuzzy puppy hair had straightened, and she had apparently grown more. She definitely bulked up. The muscle definition along her front legs and the thighs of her back legs stood out clearly. She bounded towards me, and, as weak as I felt, I feared she might topple me, but she slowed at the last moment and reared up on her hind legs. She threw her front legs and paws around me and gave me an all-too-human hug. My dog had definitely become a stranger. Later that day, we plotzed on the sofa and watched TV. Not something we did too often. Not much worth watching, just dreck and drivel. Again with the grouchy, nearly angry thoughts. I still felt awful, and before I knew it, I awoke to late afternoon sun pouring through one of the living room windows. Guess TV was even more boring than usual, I thought as I blinked away the drowsiness. Oh, right, I mused. I took one of the prescription pain pills before I arrived home. The odor of something savory wafted in from the dining area. I creaked and groaned my way to my feet. Nothing unusual. Something always hurt these days. The muting effect of the pain medicine had worn off, and I was hurting enough that I feared that I would not die. Internal laugh. I got that one from Rhonda. There was a freshly heated microwave dinner on the table. Weird. I didn't recall getting up and making that. I looked over towards the front entrance. I really couldn't call it a door, since there wasn't one. Yet there was a nice sheet of heavy plastic over the damaged portal. The very piece from the garage I'd had in mind. Definitely didn't remember getting up to doing that. I considered the possibilities. 1, I was on more or better drugs than I realized. 2, I'd snapped. 3, a good Samaritan had come in and set everything up while I rested. Maybe Doc Stone? 4, the good folk, the Fae, had come at last and put up my door and made a meal for me. Now I'd have to put out milk and treats for them. I went with number 1 for the time being. I must have been semi-lucid. Maybe I'd taken another pill? No idea, but I was hungry. The infection had left me nauseous until I fell asleep on the couch. Now I was ravenous. I quickly devoured the meatball and pasta dinner, cleaned up, and then more closely inspected the temporary repair work on the front door. Yep, I realized. It had definitely been number 1. It was clearly the work of an intoxicated person. I guess that didn't rule out number 2. Still, it was weird. I'd never had a lost time episode. Good dope. I heard a rush of feet coming down the stairs. Lacy had run up while I consumed supper. I looked over to the table, and there she stood. Stood? Well, her front paws were splayed on the tabletop. Just a doggy lean. Whew, those painkillers. Odd that she'd taken to standing on her hind legs so much. She had been good about jumping on me only during play. Then today there was the hug, and now this. Dang, her front paws have gotten huge. Dale's nails definitely needed trimming. Lacy, you know better. Down off the table. She looked at me, confused, then a little annoyed, before she dropped backwards onto her haunches and stared at me expectantly. "Thank you, dear lady," I said, and gave her a little bow. She gave me a radiant pooch smile. My reverie over the mysteries of my meal and the door repairs were short-lived. I took my evening dose and went up to bed. I heard Lacy trundle up behind me, but I didn't look at her. It was what I'd expected her to do, what she always did. At the top of the stairs, I felt the blood rush into my head and I became suddenly dizzy. I snatched at the stair rail as I tumbled backwards. Then my fall was arrested, and I was gently pushed back onto my feet. I stumbled onto the top of the landing and looked back to see Lacy on her hind feet once again, now wearing a look of concern. She caught me and set me on my feet, I thought in astonishment, and almost experienced another head rush. "What's up with you, silly dog?" I murmured as I turned and shuffled down the hallway to my room. After a moment, I heard her feet padding along behind me. I awakened in a more lucid and energetic mood. Lacy gave me a quick sniff check and then trotted into the hallway on all fours. Must have been imagining things last night. Definitely some fine prescription dope. She likely had to go, and she would definitely be hungry, I realized. As I finished cooking breakfast and placed it on the table, I heard my phone give a text notification. It was Dr. Stone. "Lacy back yet?" I confirmed that she was and that we'd be hanging around the house while I recuperated. She wished me well, and I wished her a good day at the office. When I finished typing, I looked up and there was Lacy, seated in the chair at the other end of the table, grinning almost like normal, but she leaned back onto her haunches, her elbows bent upward and tucked to her side, her paws and claws drooping. There was something sinister about the way she looked at me. The grin was wicked and somehow familiar. Her ears had begun to point more, almost like they were cropped, and had they grown closer towards the crown of her head? She sat tall in the seat. Tall, not long. WTF, I thought in text language. I'd never thought or spoken in text language, but this had become a freak show. "That does it. We're going back to see Dr. Stone, young lady." She just widened that awful grin and huffed a little. Not quite a bark, not quite a laugh. Yet no sooner did we get through the side door by the truck than she froze, much like the night she'd been attacked. She stared into the trees for a moment, then dashed out into the shadows of the morning, once more on all fours, but running with an odd gait, as though her front legs had grown faster than the rear. I called after her in vain, and after a while I decided to just go into town and see the good doctor without the dog. Maybe a good idea. Not sure what the other patient owners would think of her behavior. I wasn't that familiar with the locals. I'd only been up on weekends until late last year, when I'd pulled the trigger on retirement. I clambered in behind the wheel of my pickup and reached over the handle to close the door. That's when I heard an ear-splitting howl, higher pitched than the ones from the were-woman wolf, younger somehow, like those of an early adolescent compared to a grown person. Oh, Lacy, what have we gotten into? The next few months went by in a blur. The DA had declined charges, and there was only a brief mention in the news that Lacy Elbert had been found deceased. There was oddly very little said about it. In a small town, rumor gets around, but everyone had gone silent on the subject. At least I was off the hook. Our home had a new front door, but the faint odor of death still lingered, at least to my senses. Miriam, Dr. Stone to you, said it was just my imagination. The dinner date had gone well. As for Lacy, she grew, not only in stature but in strangeness. She spent most of her time roaming the vast timberland nearby. Yet she came back to visit occasionally. We knew it was her, despite the changes to her appearance. Miriam helped me with some online research. Lacy had become a dog man or dog woman. Many of those creatures were known to look ferocious, but still avoid harming people. Lacy was like that. We surmised that if a werewolf, a human who morphed at least partway into a wolf, part of the family Canis, because it was infected, then perhaps a dog, already a member of Canis, would morph partway into human under the same circumstances. Perhaps one capable of making a microwave dinner and completing a temporary repair? Nah. Option 1 it was, and well, had to be. Miriam and I sat out on the front porch, drinking iced tea and relaxing in the evening shadows. I'd just finished crooning that old standard, By the Light of the Silvery Moon. She'd just have to get used to that, though she didn't seem to mind too much. In fact, she wiggled a little closer. From the near distance, a deep-throated howl sounded, a hunting howl. Shortly from within the tree line, we saw a pair of red glowing eyes, about 6 feet off the ground. The silhouette of a canid with sharp ears at the top of her head appeared, and then the lean, muscular figure emerged into the waning light and stalked towards the porch. Reddish-blonde fur gleaming, sweet Lacy approached, her tail wagging, and the sinister yet friendly smile spread across her features as she approached us. She'd become a large, fearsome being, yet she dropped to all fours and gave each of us a doggy kiss. Oh, that breath! So quoth this raven. This is such... Hello, my darlings. Today we have more of that dog lady, Lacy. Beautiful Dreamer by bearLair64. Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me. Starlight and dewdrops are waiting for thee. Sounds of the rude world heard in the day, lulled by the moonlight, will all pass away. My latest rendition of the old standard tune ended abruptly as I heard a familiar ruff and a low growl from just inside the trees. It was getting late, and I decided that after a long afternoon of yard work, it would be nice to relax in the shadows of the forest. I'd also held out some hope that my best friend might make an appearance, and there she was, preternaturally still, standing near the trunk of a large pine. She peeked around the bole in a playful manner, yet her eyes blazed red and her mouth gaped in an awful grin, full of fangs and horror. And were we standing closer to one another, I knew a foul stench. I grinned back at her. "Hey, sweet lady, I take it you are well?" Her menacing grin widened, and she panted a little in pleasure at the greeting as she stepped from behind a big pine and walked towards me. As she drew near, she dropped to all fours and nuzzled my hand in a doggy greeting. She gave out a little whine. Dogs know how to play people. There was a hint in that sound as though she desperately needed just a scratch behind the ears and above the base of her tail to save her life. "Drama queen," I said to the massive beast that had started life as a fluffy little puppy. My fluffy little puppy, Lace. Yet I relented, as we knew I would, and proffered the scratches. She rose once more and gave me a quick dog kiss on the cheek. I had to choke back a gag at the odious wave of her breath. Then she stepped back and gave me her best goofy dog grin, mixed with the way her face had evolved into the more sinister features. "You want to have supper with me?" I knew she wouldn't. Months after her final transformation, she preferred her own fresh kills, but it had become one of our games for me to ask. She surprised me, though, by getting a twinkle in her otherwise ballful eyes and nodding. "Well, I have a pot roast in the crock." She turned and bounded back a little ways into the tree line and dropped to all fours again. She raced around through the trees and popped out again a little ways from me, a piece of wet, dripping dead critter in her maw. Even as a dogman, Lucy had a great sense of humor. One just had to speak to understand the doggish language. Maybe dogginese? I thought as we walked over to the back porch and the little patio set. It's amazing what we can adapt to and perceive as normal when we love those involved. I ate pot roast with some grilled veggies, and Lacy chomped her raw red meat, still giving off a little steam. Poor creature's temperature must have been up after running from my pooch lady. Miriam had to work late this evening, or she'd have joined us. Someone had an injured cow or bull or something. Lacy stopped mid-chomp and looked at me askance. She said it may have been coyotes or feral dogs. You have a different theory? I feared for a moment that she may have gone more feral than expected. Nah, not Lacy. She actually understands what would happen if she fed on livestock, I thought, all too willing to give her a pass. She sat silently for a moment, clearly trying to think of a way to clearly communicate what she knew or believed she knew. Finally, she stretched her head down low and used her right foreclaw to point at her neck, the place where she had 4 pink scars from when the Lacy Elbert werewolf bit her and started this journey. I leaned back in my patio chair. "So you think it was another werewolf?" At that, she gave a little shrug. I was often surprised at how much she'd picked up off human gestures. Maybe so many millennia of human and canine interaction had led to some cross-species nonverbal communication gestures. I'd read something on dogs actually understanding humans better than we realize. Besides, Lacy had been exceptional, at least in my perfectly unbiased view. Eye roll. Not sure. Just not coyotes or dogs. She gave me a nod. Well, golly gee, Lassie, did little Timmy get bitten by the other Lacy before he fell down the well and needed to be rescued? Her look was priceless. The sinister dogman features contorted in deep and genuine confusion. She looked quite hideous, so naturally I laughed. Sorry, girl. There was no way for you to get that reference. I just meant that it seems we may have another monster on our hands. She resumed her normal, merely sinister grin, jaw gaping, gleaming fangs displayed, and a little drool escaping from one side where her tongue lolled. "Tell you what, I'll get with Miriam and work on the who might be missing angle. And you? Well, keep doing your thing. A few people know about you. I had to tell Sheriff Cloud so that if anyone sees you and freaks out, he can read direct. I told that nice lead paramedic, too. She needed to know about the toxic bites and scratches. So maybe the high sheriff will have some information for us." Lacy had gulped down the remainder of her meal and clearly wanted to get back into the woods. So we rose and I hugged and patted my enormous rescue shelter pup and rubbed her back. She tilted her head up a little and gave a little howl of pleasure, parting in sheer joyful exuberance. Then in a flash, she swirled away and vanished into the darkness. We both had work to do. Valerie pulled out onto the highway from the parking lot of Pliny's Delight Package Store. Fine wines, liquor, and beer. She was en route back to her dead-end little hometown and would need the booze to numb her mind to the utter boredom that would ensue for the duration of her stay. She'd come down for her brother's memorial service about 6 months before and was now back to sell their ancestral estate. She rolled her eyes. If you can call a 3-bedroom wood-frame house on half an acre an estate. Still, she would sell eventually, and she could use the income to pay off her townhome in the big city. They'd cremated Philippe before she'd arrived, and the local yokels had been short of answers as to what exactly had happened to him. She still had a few acquaintances. No real friends, but a few who might talk under the right circumstances, in complete privacy and confidence, or if there was something in it for them. So far, all she knew was that her brother's trashy girlfriend had been responsible. Still, it didn't make sense. She thought for the umpteenth time as she made the nighttime drive towards the wide spot in the road that she'd called home until her 18th birthday. Her father had disappeared when she was 9, and in the intervening years, she'd lost her mother and now her baby brother, Phil. Phil had been pretty smitten with Lacy Elbert. The girl had been pretty, but Valerie thought that there was something wild about her. Not in the partying sense, but rather something gamey, she decided. A bit of the local wilderness infected the young woman. That's probably what Phil had liked. He had enjoyed the great outdoors, of which there was plenty in this area. The trees went on for miles. "Merde!" she exclaimed, as her headlights lit up a large animal in front of her speeding jeep. It ran across the road and scampered into some trees on the other side. If something so large could be said to have scampered, she braked and swerved to avoid a collision and knew that it had cleared the roadway, but a thump sounded on her passenger side rear fender and caused her to swerve. Something large had struck her vehicle. Once she corrected the skid, she pressed her brakes and checked the mirrors. In the bright red of the brake lights, she saw an enormous hair-covered figure that stood in the middle of the highway in a menacing posture, arms akimbo, claws on display, and ferocious maw open, and emitting a roar. She had slowed significantly, and as she started, fixated at the horrific scene behind her, she nearly failed to note the return of the first figure that had darted in front of her. This one was slightly less bulging, but had longer and wilder hair. It ran at her car from within the blackness of the nighttime forest, now on 2 legs. Instead of stopping, she smoothly pressed the accelerator to avoid the loping beast. It struck the driver's side fender, and she heard the ear-splitting shriek of razor talons as they scraped the metal of her vehicle in an attempt to seize and stop the machine. She continued to accelerate and saw in the mirror that both nightmares now chased her on all fours and were closing fast. She downshifted and pushed the engine to red line before gearing back up. It was a near thing, but eventually when she checked the mirrors, the duo had vanished into the gloom. She shook with fear and the effects of massive adrenaline dump. She glanced around nervously in fear that at any moment one or both of the bipedal lupine horrors would pounce from the murky shadows. She slowly regained control of her breathing. In through the nose. 3 count, hold. 3 count, release. 3 count. After 3 sets, she felt slightly more calm. She desperately wanted to stop and look at the damage her Jeep had surely sustained, but she didn't dare. Maybe it would be a good time to have a word with the local law enforcers. She needed a police report for the insurance company, and she might be able to coax some information from them if she properly played the part of a damsel in distress. Deputy Barnum met her at the house to take her report. Valerie wasn't sure about how to describe the creatures that attacked her, so she went for the simplest explanation, of which she tried to convince herself during the drive to her little hometown. People in outlandish costumes. She could tell that Deputy Barnum was skeptical. He worked very hard to project his disbelief. "So, ma'am, you're saying you saw these people, maybe in costumes, maybe with large dogs, after you left the liquor store?" She crossed her arms defiantly and in frustration. "For the 4th time, yes. I haven't had a drop and none of my containers are open. In fact, you can see that they fell from my front seat onto the floor. I haven't even cleaned out the car nor gone inside the house. I don't know who or what the beings were, but they were hairy and tall and hit my Jeep hard enough to do that." She pointed at the large dent in the passenger side, rear fender, and the deep gouges along the driver's side. Deputy Barnum nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I just want to get it straight for the record. Did you see either of them hold any instruments that could do that damage? Maybe an iron rake or garden tool?" Valerie chewed her lip. She really wanted to punch this backwoods Sherlock and deal with the hounds of the backwoodsville herself. Maybe, but there was no long handles. They could have carried some sort of claw instrument. The interview went on for another 15 minutes or so, and Deputy Barnum gave her some unsatisfying and unlikely assurances that the sheriff's department would look into the incident and that she could pick up a copy of the report day after tomorrow. While it was good to have the incident recorded, she had the feeling that Barnum knew something more, but was hesitant to tell her. Well, she could at last mix that favorite drink. Mr. Arends from the bank brought his dog Fritz and said that he saw a notice of foreclosure about to be served on the Elbert place. I thought old Kenny would have left it to his nephew and niece, Nancy and Drew. Huh! I don't think they could read, much less solve mysteries. They live even further out in the sticks, though. Maybe they never found out about the inheritance. Miriam speculated as we reclined on the sofa. She'd had yet another long day, mainly backed-up appointments from after her moo cow emergency. Well, I wonder who was left of them after Sheriff Cloud and the JP told me about the murders. Any idea if the boyfriend had any family? I didn't want to press her with bigger questions. She was tired. Oh, yes, he was a local boy, but his daddy ran off when he was little. And then his sister went off to college and work in the big city. Then his mom died. Sweet lady. His wife was like a country song. I was a teenager, my daddy run off, and my mama died. I was smitten and bitten by my werewolf girlfriend. She sang the last in a silly, twangy voice and tune. "How's the cow?" I asked innocently. If she was too tired, she'd give a short answer. If she felt like talking, then we could discuss it. Certainly not coyotes or even a cougar. The bite radius was huge. If we had bears, maybe something like a large wolf or dog? She trailed off, and I could hear the question and the implications that Lacy could be the culprit. I knew that Miriam wouldn't want to believe it, but she, like me, had to know for sure. "Well, it wasn't a certain dog girl," I asked her. "She thinks there may be another werewolf. I must say I agree. One had to have infected the Elbert girl. I just don't know that much about werewolves. She looked pretty similar to our Lacy, and they both went on 4 legs as often as 2. But there was a different quality and some difference in shape. That Lacy was tremendously spiteful to our Lacy. Definitely held a grudge about that first night. I still think Lacy must have gotten in the way of her hunt for a meal. Maybe I'll ask her." Miriam chuckled. "You're the only man I've ever heard of who can hold a conversation with his dog. Those rescue puppies are remarkable. Oh, and so are you. The rest of that evening is none of your business. But I had noticed that since I recovered from the werewolf scratches, I'd been feeling vigorous. My aches and pains all but forgotten." I sat across from Sheriff Gene Cloud in his office, and we each sipped on a cup of very good coffee. Apparently, over his years in the law enforcement, old Gene had become a connoisseur de café. We'd come to the end of pleasantries and small talk. He got around to the point. "Earl, I hate to ask, but do you think that, dog of yours, do you think she may have had anything to do with the attack on that steer? Thing is, the bite and the claw marks would be consistent with, well, you know, a creature of her size and configuration." Jean and I had become friends since the night we called the Howling Incident, after the old werewolf movie from the 80s, so I could understand why he was hesitant to ask. I think that he really didn't want it to be Lacy either. "Well, that would sound weird to anyone else, but you've seen some things." I asked her, and it was my turn to be hesitant. She denies it. Thinks it may be another werewolf. Jean nodded. "Oddly, the fact that you talked to your transmogrified pooch is not what concerns me. However, I've worked with enough teens and young adults to know that sometimes they come up with convenient and usually imaginary culprits to redirect attention from their behavior to other parties. It's not that they're being bad. It's a pretty normal type of psychological avoidance. They don't want to hurt or disappoint a respected figure in their lives, and they don't want to process the guilt they feel." I shook my head. "Lacy started life as a dog. She doesn't really know how to lie. I haven't taught her, so now I believe her. I know how parents are about defending their kids. They'll employ all sorts of mental gymnastics to avoid acknowledging the poor behavior of their brats. You know, Mr. Masters of Science, denial." I smiled at the last to ensure he knew I was teasing. I actually respected his formal education, and he'd been right about the concept of avoidance. Lacy was still pretty young. Nah, I couldn't start doubting her. She was a good girl. We discussed the possibilities of other wildlife that could have been involved, or even humans. In the end, the Lord High Sheriff of the county decided it would remain a mystery. He'd put animal predation on the report so the owner could file an insurance claim for the loss. I think he may still have suspected Lacy, but he let it go, mainly because there was no real evidence, but also because he was a county sheriff, and we were friends. Always easier to believe the reality we want, Mr. Psych Major. Benny Diaz had had a long day. This last service had been the worst. It had taken him 2 hours to find the manufactured home on its quarter-acre plot. Why can't they just call them trailers? Hiding the wheels and adding fake shutters doesn't change anything, he thought with distaste. Doesn't matter, I'll soon be home and enjoying Danetta's fine cooking. Now I need to ensure that no feral animals or humans had taken up residence in or around the trailer or the little shed to one side before he risked an approach up to the raised porch and knocked on the front door. Per policy, he knocked on the door and called out his name and company, and that he was there to serve process. No answer. No surprise. He checked the windows and saw that the lights were out. He was pretty sure that the power had been cut off already. He posted the notice on the door and gave warning that the mortgage payments of the one Kenneth Elbert were in arrears and that the foreclosure process would begin in 60 days. There was more to the initial notice, and the bank had added the names of the co-beneficiaries of Kenneth Elbert's last will and testament, his twin niece and nephew, Nancy and Drew Elbert. Done. Now for home. He didn't finish the thought, as he suddenly found himself airborne and flying from the raised porch at the front door. The earth rose up to meet him, and he felt some of the ribs on his left side snap. Some of the right may have been snapped as well, but the shredded flesh above them stung, burned, and hurt too much for him to be sure. He attempted to choke in a breath, in genuine misery, when a set of jaws clamped onto the back of his neck, and the beast that had been Drew Elbert shook him like a terrier shakes rats. His neck snapped just like a rodent. His final thought was, Danetta's fine cooking. Now he'd be on the receiving end of supper. Valerie drew up to the trailer where her erstwhile soon-to-be sister-in-law and her parents had lived, where the parents and her brother had died. It wasn't a terrible place. It was a fairly recent model of manufactured home. Phil had helped Kenny Elbert build that really nice, if very tall, porch. The whole place sat on a slight slope that left the front entrance higher off the ground than the back door entrance. She'd never been here as a child or teen. Lacy Elbert was younger than both she and her brother, so there was no need to go out that way. The place looked empty, though, despite the newer model car parked in the driveway, and had the quality of silence that speaks of lingering abandonment. Even the air smelled of. "Phew!" she exclaimed as she retched, and the acid rose into her chest and burned uncomfortably. The smell out in the yard was foul. Blood, opened bowels, and early stages of decay. Something had clearly expired in a violent manner nearby. Something large. There it was, a mass of dried gore, lumps of flesh, and some scattered broken bones. The rounded mound of a skull protruded from the middle. A human skull, she realized in consternation. She scrambled for her phone, dialed the emergency number, and darted her gaze around to scan for danger. Likely long gone, but she didn't want to take chances. The nearest neighbors had property lines that ran up near the home, but their houses and mobiles were far enough from this one that everyone had at least the illusion of privacy, and there were screens of bushes on the front and back property lines of the trailer. That meant there was likely no eyes on her. However, she walked back to her Jeep and stood by the driver door. The signal was pretty weak, so she didn't want to risk losing it by getting inside the metal box on wheels. Besides, she'd seen too many horror movies where people jumped into cars to be safe. Then wham! The monster, or whatever, got them. The dispatcher finally answered and asked for the nature of her emergency. She gave her location and said she'd found human remains. No, fresh remains. The blood looked dried, but I didn't want to go near the thing. It's grotesque. The operator assured her that deputies and the ambulance were on the way, and she should remain calm and stay on the line. Valerie rolled her eyes and thought uncharitably, if I have to keep conversing with you, Cousin Ellie Mae, I will lose it. She pretended to have signal issues, then dropped the call. She looked around nervously. She knew it would take time for help to arrive. She warily watched the wood line on the north side of the property. Any creepy crawlers would come from that direction. She was startled, and adrenaline shock washed through her body when the double tap of a small car horn sounded sharply from behind her. Merde, I'm tired of these jump scares, she shouted internally as she turned to face the roadway. A small car that had seen better days long ago sat rattling and rumbling in the driveway entrance, but still facing down the road. Likely a neighbor. Howdy, you looking for the Elberts? A youngish man in a ball cap asked as he leaned his elbow on the open window. Valerie eyed him. She knew enough about the people in the area to understand that he was likely just trying to help and was only a little nosy. Actually, I know what happened to them. My brother Philippe was dating Lacy. I just came to see because of what happened. He nodded. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm from the next house up the way with my folks. I met Phil. He sure was nice. I'm sorry about your loss. You just had that look about you that said you might need help. Valerie nodded. Well, actually, I just got off the phone with the sheriff's department dispatch. There are human remains over there on the far side of the porch. A real mess. Would you mind staying here with me until they arrive? It should only be a few minutes. The young man hesitated just a moment to process what he had just heard, then nodded. He moved his car so that it would not block the driveway, then parked it and got out to approach Valerie. Sean Mason, he said as he extended a hand for a shake. Val LaFiva, she responded. I grew up around here, but have been gone a few years. Yeah, I remember Phil said something about a big sister in the big city. So where? At that point, the breeze shifted, and the smell registered, and he blanched and stepped backwards, and waved his hand frantically as though fending off an assault on his nostrils. Despite her stress level, Valerie had to suppress a laugh at the look on his face. Yet Sean seemed to handle it well. He recovered his composure and walked a little closer to the pile that had once been a person. I wouldn't get too close, Valerie warned. He or she, who can tell, is beyond first aid, and the cops will likely want to look for evidence. Wouldn't want to mess up a crime scene. He nodded and halted his forward progress, but started. I dunno, but I think it's a guy. That's a tie near the skull. Maybe just blood splatter, but I think it's an ugly tie. Shortly the wail of sirens sounded in the distance, and the cavalry arrived to save the day. It was late afternoon, and getting on towards the end of the day before they released Valerie from the scene. They'd cut Sean loose within an hour. He had to get to work at the plant. Valerie, who was a relative stranger, and who had filed a decent, suspicious report, well, she had to remain on the foul-smelling scene. The deputies had finished speaking with her and asked her to wait, and then had gotten busy. She hung out with the nice lead paramedic, Julie, while the techs processed the scene and waited for the sheriff and JP to arrive. She and Julie could hear snippets of the conversation others had. Same as the steer the other day. Had to be big, just like that one brook. Footprints, woods. Valerie jumped a little when Julie spoke. We had a scene like this a while back. Well, a little different, but just as messy. Over The Brooks house. Used to be the Lee's family place. She looked at Val to see if there was any hint of recognition. Yes, I know where the Lees lived. I went to school with one of the daughters. Who are the Brooks? Julie shrugged. Just one, Mr. Brooks, an older man and his dog. Well, I guess they'd both be Brooks. She laughed a little at that. And it seemed to Val that only Julie knew why that was funny. He had just had to shoot Lacy Elbert. You may have heard rumors about that or seen the one news report. He had a nasty scratch on his arm from somewhere wild person or critter. Something big. She raised her chin towards the scene, and Val followed her gaze, quickly lost in thought. Within the hedge and brush property, boundaries squatted two unnaturally still figures, each with its large ears turned to what the human said. They were pleased that it had not taken long to draw attention after they took out the human that was taking away the home that Uncle Kenny had meant for them. They soon knew that the Valerie human was related to Cousin Lacy's boyfriend. Lacy had probably not intended to kill him. Drew listened carefully to what the females said, and Nancy focused on the conversation of the humans who worked around what they called the scene. They shortly had the information they sought for some time. An old man and his dog had attacked their cousin and killed her. Now they knew where he lived. Brooks, the old Lee place. Deputy Barnum made it to the scene at the Elbert residence near the beginning of his shift, just in time to meet with the cleanup crew assigned to pick up the corpse. They'd worked by standing lights and headlights of their cars since it was past nightfall. He would only have to be on site for a short time. "Hey, fellas, you need help with anything?" "Nah, we got it, Barnum." "Look out for the smell. Still some left," one of the techs advised him. "Nowhere near as bad as the Elbert chick, but still pretty ripe." A deep-throated, angry growl arose from just within the woodline. It was quickly followed by a slightly higher-pitched one, and then some scuffling noises and the breaking of branches as large bodies moved deeper into the forest. Barnum looked up, startled, as the two remaining techs whipped their heads towards the trees. There was no sign that anything was there, and only the movements of a few small branches indicated that anyone or anything had been just out of sight. Observing. "I'm going to get the trunk to get my rifle, just in case," Barnum informed the others. As his trunk lid squealed open and he reached for his AR platform rifle, a deep octave rose from within the woods, quickly joined by a howl of anger, frustration, and grief. The reverberation sent cold shivers up Barnum's spine, and the two techs finished up quickly. He was very happy when they cleared the scene, and didn't envy the sheriff, Cloud, and Justice Jenny Fiore, who still had to notify the widow. Despite the mess of the body, they had quickly identified the victim by his license plates, what was left of his face, and the driver's license in his wallet. It was only on his way back to the more settled areas, where he normally patrolled, that Barnum thought about the report that Valerie Lefevre had made. It sounded like what she had described. Giant wolves that could run on 2 or 4. So quoth this raven. Lacy, Beautiful Dreamer, Part 2, Second Half, by bearLair64. I awakened at 4:44 exactly. According to my phone, I felt like I'd heard something. The air condition must have been running hard. It felt cold in the bedroom. Even with Miriam's warm body beside me, I lay there and listened and thought about getting up to adjust the thermostat. But I really didn't want to. I wanted to sleep. I'd just started to drift off to dreamland when I shot up at the sound of deep-throated howls that emerged from the woods behind the house. That's not Lacy, I thought. Sounds like two or more. Sounds more like that other Lacy. Miriam, accustomed to arising quickly for emergencies, stirred and asked why Lacy had come to visit so early and why she felt the need to make so much noise. She apparently hadn't fully awakened. It's all right, love. Sleep on. I'll take a look. I crept down the stairs, shotgun in one hand, handheld spotlight in the other. I was ready in case of another werewolf attack. Once you've experienced one, you'll never feel completely safe. At least I hadn't, and when I reached the front door, I shuddered. The sounds I'd heard the night I had to kill Lacy Ebert had returned. The heavy treads on the front porch, the scratching and rattling at the door. I clicked off the safety and prepared to blast away through the front portal to my home once again, when I heard a different howl cut through the gloom of the night outside. Lacy's howl. Once more, my girl and I would face the danger side by side. I knew she was there to help. Her sound had come from very close to the house. I couldn't risk a blind shot through the door. I shifted over to one of the windows on either side of the door. I hung the handle of the big light on my thumb and used the rest of my fingers to grasp the curtain and pull it aside. My already pounding pulse skipped ahead several beats when I saw what the dim exterior light displayed. The face was a close match for the one I'd seen in the woods after I attacked Lacy, and then again when Lacy Elbert had burst through my front door in animal fury. The beast snarled at me through the glass, but quickly looked over its shoulder. Another, even larger creature stood beside it, facing full on into the front yard, lit by the gibbous moon. Both creatures spied something just out of my vision, a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Lacy was here to help. I had to back her. Both monsters leapt from the porch and moved incredibly swift towards my girl. I ran to the front door and flung it open, heedless of any threat they may pose. I'd taken down one werewolf with a 12-gauge. I could handle two. The situation evolved quickly out of my control as Lacy bounded away into the trees, the others in hot pursuit. The big one stopped and looked back at me when I stepped out on the porch and screamed, "Stop! You leave her alone, bastards!" I hesitated and was lost. I was able to hit it with at least a few pellets of .00 buckshot. The blast set my ears to ringing, and the impact set the beast to snarling after a startled yelp of pain and surprise. I used the recoil to pump in the next round, a slug, but there was nothing ahead of me but darkness. I stepped back inside to retrieve the spotlight I dropped when I saw that ghastly face at my window. I shone it into the woods and could find nothing. I heard a hunting howl drift through the trunks and limbs. Then some other sounds, almost like barks and snarls, but they faded into the night. I had no way to track them or to help my Lacy. I called Sheriff Cloud on his cell phone. I was one of a handful of people outside of the department who had that number. His exhausted voice answered, "Sheriff Cloud, what's the emergency?" "Sheriff, it's me, Earl. 2 werewolves just attacked Lacy. They chased her into the woods. I shot one, but I don't think I hurt it. Not badly. Will you come over and help? As soon as it's light, I want to go out and look." "Slow down, Earl. Let me get fully awake. We had a bad scene earlier today at the old Elbert place. I've only had a few hours of sleep, so I'm groggy." Eventually, I gave him a clear report and reminded him that with what was involved, he'd instructed me to call him directly. He said that he and a couple of his deputies would be on scene at first light with tracking dogs. I thanked them and looked over to see a set of concerned features watching me from just inside the kitchen. Then I noticed the enticing smell of coffee. Miriam. True to his word, just as the first rays of the sun penetrated the forest tops, Sheriff Gene Cloud arrived. He had a tired-looking Barnum and another deputy with him. As they unloaded, a pickup arrived with 2 baying hounds in the back, the trackers. I felt better immediately. Lacy hadn't returned, and I'd been worried sick about her. What had all those monsters done? Could she handle them by herself? Maybe the smaller one. She looked a little flabby for a monster, but that big one, that one that had a beer gut along with his massive chest and shoulders, he'd give her problems if he could catch her. We got through greetings and introductions quickly. I showed Jean where the creatures had left, behind Muddy Foot, whatever prints on my porch, and had left claw marks on the door frame. I pointed over to where the tracks led between the bowls. I didn't want to walk over there, thought it might mess up the dogs, the scent. But I must have hit it. There's a nice splash of blood and drops leading into the woods. The tracker brought over the 2 hounds, but he had to all but drag them to the blood-stained grass. They whined and tugged at their leads, more interested in hopping back into the bed of his pickup truck than in tracking brutes. Eventually, despite the tug-of-war and curses from their handler, they tucked their tails and laid down submissively. They refused to move, heads tucked low to the ground. I just can't understand it, Sheriff. I never seen 'em act like this. Well, he glanced at me. That one time. Sheriff Cloud nodded. It's okay. Earl knows about the Albert case. I was afraid of this. Earl, canines won't track these things. You are absolutely sure they chased Lacy? She wasn't with them? I had to choke back my anger. Of course I'm sure. They chased her away from her own home and into the dark. I'm sure I had heard a fight deep out in the woods. The tracker put up his obviously relieved hounds and took out a larger caliber rifle. The sheriff and deputies already held AR-style rifles, and I still had my shotgun. We rallied and set off, tracker in front to follow the blood trail. We didn't really need hounds for the first 100 yards or so. Then the blood dried up. The heavy layers of pine straw were hard to read, but something with large feet had shifted them enough to show the wet mass underneath the top dry layer. It took a while, but we eventually found the space where Lacy had made her stand. I looked around in fear. The forest seemed too close in around us. There was a fallen hardwood tree with the root system still intact and set up several feet from the ground. It would have covered her back nicely. My clever girl, I thought, still worried but equally proud. No obvious bodies, I contributed to the professional conversation that had occurred while I was sunk in reverie. Still some blood. The tracker pointed out the wine-red splatters on the leaves and the roots of the fallen forest giant. Big fight, lots of scuffs. At least 2, maybe, 3 from the track size. More dirt to make prints. Sure was a scrap, and it kind of stinks still, like, with that Albert thing. Can you tell where they went afterwards? I asked a little frantically. He shrugged. Looks like one went off deeper into the woods, the other 2 went off that way, the big one, and the other almost headed towards town. He looked towards Sheriff Cloud and shrugged again, as if to say, It's up to you, Sheriff. Jean made a call to his day shift supervisor and to dispatch. They were to alert him directly of any reports of large animal sightings or attacks. I desperately wanted to follow what I was sure was Lacy's trail, but Jean convinced me to stay with the group and follow the killers, the true threat. Along the way, he told me about the scene at the Albert place the previous day, of how vicious it was and how little was left of Benny Diaz. They weren't just monstrosities. They were human killers and eaters. We followed the trail for a couple of miles before we hit a patch of wetland marsh. Not a true swamp, just a low area that held water and the blackened remains of fallen trees and old stumps that had rotted in the muck and mess. Without dogs to sniff the way, we lost the trail. We backtracked to my place, and everybody went about their day and their business. I thanked Jean and the others profusely and assured them that I would stay alert. Before he left, Jean pulled me aside. "Earl, I'm violating some laws and my own policies, I'm sure, but take this." He handed me a metal cylinder with a ring and pin handle at one end. "If they get on your porch again, it will sting 'em with rubber pellets and soak 'em in pepper spray. It won't stop 'em, but it may give you enough time to get a clean shot. Just pull the ring, make sure it's all the way out, and toss it. Best to toss it around a corner. Look, they seem to have an interest in your place or in Lacy, maybe both. The other scene was out of town, different direction, but it was unlikely just a coincidence that it occurred at the Elbert place. A young local, well, she moved away, but she's back visiting. Saw 2 enormous man-beasts. Claim they attacked her in her Jeep while she was driving out on the main highway. Her brother was Lacy Elbert's boyfriend. She's the one who found Benny's remains. Something weird's going on here, and it's all connected. Please be safe and keep your shotgun handy. I'm going to set up a deputy on your place at night. They'll still have to take calls, but you'll have someone watching from close by most of the time. Doing the same for Miss Lefevre." With that, we said our goodbyes, take cares, and wish you wells. It was a good thing he told me about Valerie Lefevre, since she showed up on my front porch that afternoon. She dropped Julie, the paramedic's name, as a means of introduction, and to explain how she found me. I'd been out back, anxiously hoping that Lacy would make an appearance. Miriam, Dr. Stone, had gone to work at her office, but remained on standby for an emergency house call. We touched bases throughout the day by text. I'd done what little I could to take care of my no longer so little pup. I invited Valerie to join me in my vigil, though I didn't tell her that's what I was doing. She turned out to be a fan of my iced tea, and we each held a glass and pondered the forest of fear that spread before us. "So I understand that you had an adventure on your way into town," I asked after we spent a little time talking about everything but what we both wanted to. "Yes, sir. I know it sounds strange, but I promise. I wasn't drinking, and I don't do any drugs. As far as I know, I have no mental health challenges. Yet I was attacked by 2, werewolves." She stopped and looked at me to see if I'd disagree or get angry or dismissive. It had to have been difficult for her to tell the story in the first place, and now to have to repeat it. "As of last night, I've seen them too," I assured her. "I saw another like them several months ago. It attacked me, and I had to shoot it. It turned out to be Lacy Elbert." I hesitated, but she needed to know. "It also attacked my dog, little Lacy. She was just leaving puppyhood. The attack, a bite on the scruff of her neck, led to some changes. She looks a lot like one of the wares, but cleaner. Not scruffy, and her joints are still like a dog's rather than a human's. A reverse werewolf, if you will. Like the way a human turns partway into a wolf, so a dog, close relative to the wolf, turns partway into human." She was smart. I liked her. Got it in one. Only with Lacy, she'd already thought she was a human girl. The daughter my Rhonda and me never had. I must have gone wistful at that, and we sat together in silence for a moment. She leapt to her feet. "Get the gun," she called excitedly, and pointed towards the woods. I saw the outline before I saw her poor, sweet face. The pointed ears near the top of her head gave away her identity instantly. Besides, she was my girl. I'd know her anywhere. "It's okay. We're safe," I told Valerie. That's Lacy. She's just shy because she doesn't know you. If you like, stand back inside the house, but I can promise you're safer with her than with me, and you are 100% safe with me." Not exactly eloquent, but my nerves were taut, and I was concerned for Lacy. Valerie remained beside me on the porch, smart and brave. I like her even more, I decided. I called out to my dog girl. "It's okay, Lacy. Val's a friend. She knows. Come on up. I know it's still light, but we have to take a look. I'll call Miriam to come help." I looked on in shock as Lacy limped into the yard on all threes. She held up her left rear leg and avoided putting weight on it. It was swollen and the flesh on her thigh was torn, clearly raked with talons. There was what looked like a bite mark on her face. She had several smaller wounds, but I wanted to get her inside and stable. I helped her as best as I could to clamber up the stairs and into the living room. I soon had her stretched out on the couch with a clean towel pressed against her bleeding face. Poor Val looked on at first in horror, then in fascination as I brought my best friend into the house. I must admit, she took it better than I would have. She even helped Lacy navigate the stairs. A being that would be well over 6 feet in height standing, with ferocious fangs and a sinister gaping mouth, long solid claws. A monster. A real-to-life monster, but tame? Not quite, but friendly enough. I called Miriam, and it turned out she was already on her way. There were no afternoon appointments, and she'd decided to come over to comfort me while we waited for Lacy to emerge from the depths of the endless trees. She bustled in and knelt by my sweet dog, girl. You know what I mean. The one with the hideous foul breath that was diametrically opposed to her sweet disposition. "Oh, poor baby. I know it hurts. I'll get you a nice shot for the pain, and we'll get these boo-boos cleaned and stitched. Knowing you'll be healed by bedtime." Lacy licked her face in gratitude. Dr. Stone withstood the torrent of stench and drool and got down to business. Nancy paced and fretted over her brother, who was laying panting on the floor of the old tumble-down barn they'd found after the fight the previous night. She held her right forepaw inside her left to nurse the painful but rapidly healing injury to her wrist, and wore a few new bite marks up near the right side of her neck. If Drew hadn't come along, wounded or not, it would have been a very close fight with that little bitch. Before they'd been altered, she and Drew had a dog that had a litter of puppies. No one had wanted the runt, so she and Drew had taken her up to the store in town and dumped her out behind it. Along the way, they'd kicked her and thrown things at her. All in fun, of course. No serious harm done. Nothing that the shelter people couldn't fix. They'd put a collar, made of zip tie, with a cardboard tag dangling from it, that proclaimed her name was Lacy. It was a way to tease their favorite cousin, Lacy, also a runt. All in fun, of course. Now that bitch had been transformed as well, into something Nancy had never imagined. They'd also found the Brooks, the man-creature who'd slaughtered their cousin. He was more of a danger than either of them had thought. Before and after the transformation, Nancy had possessed a rare temper and a nasty disposition. Only her brother Drew and her cousin Lacy could tolerate her company. Now Lacy was dead, and her brother wounded at the hands of that Brooks. Drew groaned, in addition to the shotgun pellets that were being slowly pushed out through the entrance points in his flesh, or wrapped in fleshy nodules. He had 4 gashes from claws that had raked across his face and taken out his right eye. That would not heal for days, maybe never. The open wounds they had taken from that Lacy pup did not heal as quickly as those taken from mundane sources. Oh, that bitch! My poor Lacy healed up more quickly than I would have, but not at the supernatural pace as when she'd first been bitten. It was most of a week before she was able to put substantial weight on her rear legs. She still seemed to favor going on all fours for the time being, yet some wag had returned to her butt and tail, and she gave many more of her affluent but radiant smiles. She and Val hit it off and became instant friends. I found out that Valerie had been staying in her old family home all alone, and after I checked with Miriam, we offered her my spare room. That helped the sheriff's department tremendously. Only one place to watch. I had a house full of women. It was a little odd for me, but they were all intelligent, brave, and strong, so it was enjoyable, except for the choices on what shows to watch. On the night of day 4, I sat up in my recliner. I had the latest watch on Lucy. In the distance, I heard the howls of a successful hunt. By the morning of day 5, I'd chalked it up to a nightmare. Dr. Stone, she was only Miriam at home, had left for the office, and the girls had flopped on the sofa to watch some daytime TV drivel. I heard an SUV pull up into the driveway and up to the front porch. It was Sheriff Cloud. I met him on the porch. He got right down to business. "Earl, has Lacy been with you here since she returned?" "Of course. She hasn't been able to leave. She's no longer hobbling, but she's not yet fully healed. She's been sleeping on the couch, and Dr. Stone, Valerie, and I have stayed in the recliner in shifts to keep an eye on her. What's up?" I knew it was something bad. He wore that look. Unfortunately, I was right. "One of my deputies, Peter Barnum, you remember him from the hunt the other day?" I nodded. "He was attacked last night and mauled pretty bad. He took a call on a livestock mutilation at the Leonard place up the road from you. Another steer. Killed and mostly eaten. I was on my way, and the other deputy on duty wrapped up her DWI case and headed to him. The werewolves got there first. Maybe they heal faster than dogmen." He shook his head. "Still can't believe I can say that with a mostly straight face. Anyway, Barnum was critical. He's in the county hospital, but once he's stable, he's getting a helicopter ride to the city for trauma response." "Oh, that's awful. Pete and I have shared a few cups of coffee when he had watch duty. Seems like a good man," I said helplessly. "Is there anything we can do to help him or his family?" Gene shook his head. He looked exhausted. "No, thanks, though. I'm sure we'll put together something, but for right now we need to find the killers and put a stop to this. I'm going to kick it up to the state game warden's office. So maybe it would be a good idea to keep Lacy indoors. Maybe even upstairs for a while. She probably won't like that, but the game wardens may want to visit." He rubbed the back of his neck in embarrassment. "Oh, come on, Sheriff. You know we'll do what's needed. Yet there's something we've put off for too long. I'd like to introduce you to my girl." At that, I stepped aside, and Lacy made her way into the front porch. She was on all fours, and still her back reached to just above my waistline. "Hey, darling girl," I greeted her. This is our friend, Sheriff Gene Cloud." Lacy walked carefully down the stairs, and at the foot of them rose to her hind legs. She matched Gene's 6'4" height and looked him in the eye, all the while wearing that terrifying, lolling grin that showed her fangs to such great effort. I could see that it took every ounce of his considerable self-control to avoid stepping back and running for his life. "How do you do, Miss Lacy?" he finally squeaked out of his tight throat. Her grin widened, and she puffed out a breath of her wretch-worthy breath, directly into his face. She nodded and extended her right forepaw hand. somewhere in between, okay? Again, our sheriff met the challenge and did not toss his cookies as the wretched odor struck him. He simply smiled and shook her, let's just say, hand. Pleased to meet you finally. I've heard so much about you. At this, he studied her closely and took that step back, not in terror, but to get a better view. He looked at me, then back at her. No doubt about it. I could see how Lacy could be the culprit, but based on the description, she is clearly not. The werewolves are described as flabby or even fat. Lacy here is trim and lean. Her ears are fine and set high on her head, and her joints look like a canine. The others were reported as anthropomorphic, human-shaped, he explained for Lucy, who'd given him a brief, puzzled look. I can't believe how well You understand us, Lacy. You truly are a bright, lady. He had much to do. Apparently, Deputy Barnum had disappeared from the hospital, and while the city had jurisdiction on the hunt for him, Jean had to keep Pete's wife and kids as calm as possible and look out for their well-being. He admonished us to stay safe and assured us that he would try to have us meet the game wardens at his office. It was a little over 30 miles, but worth the drive if we could keep potentially unfriendly eyes off my pooch person. After a week, Lacy was not only healed, she was cagey. Warming up meat wasn't enough for her. She wanted to hunt. It was afternoon when the sheriff called and asked Valerie and I to come by his office to meet with the investigator from the game warden's office. Lacy remained on the porch, flopped out in the sun that slanted under the roof, and looking all too bored. Bored adolescents often get into trouble, but she seemed to understand the need to stay out of the woods until the situation was cleared up. Valerie and I told our stories once again, though I left out Lacy's transformation issues. We had decided to leave the story a little vague as to whether the creature we'd seen and that had attacked us had been beasts or people. Since he was a game warden, we leaned towards large canine or lupine animals. He assured us that there were no wolves locally, at least none that large. But perhaps it had been a large breed of dog or dog-wolf hybrid. We thanked him and left the sheriff's office as evening approached. We decided to get supper in the little city that was our county seat. Not like I got out much, and Valerie was accustomed to more variety than she'd had for the past week. We got home just at dark, and as it turned out, just in the nick of time. Lacy was absent from her perch. No surprise. Likely inside watching the news. Miriam's car was in the driveway. I'd brought them both treats, so I expected warm greetings. Then I noticed that the front door was ajar, and there was a tremendous gouges around the metal-enforced frame. Val and I looked at one another. "Call Jean," I threw over my shoulder, as I raced towards the front entrance to my house. The bag that contained the food and other items dropped carelessly in my wake. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noted a large, blurry, fuzzy mass in my peripheral vision, and I was swept off my feet and almost tackled. A rough, clawed hand covered my mouth, and the expletives that would have surely have burst forth. It was Lacy. She relaxed her hold and looked hard at me, then towards the entrance of the house. She flicked her chin upward and then stalked forward. Off the edge of the porch, she looked over her shoulder, as if she expected me to follow. I did. I looked back at Val and signed for her to get in the truck and stay there. I was sure she'd be smart enough to turn on the engine and be ready to flee if necessary. She was on the phone talking excitedly. Good. I padded along behind Lacy, who, though more massive than me, walked more quietly, almost in silence. We arrived at the back porch, and she pointed towards the back door. We crept up to it, then peered in through the kitchen window. I saw nothing unusual, nothing disturbed until I looked beyond into the living room. It was a mess. Everything scattered. The barrel of my shotgun peeked out from between the rooms, near where it normally leaned on the wall. Lacy put up a hand to keep me in place, then slowly and quietly sneaked through the back door. She fetched. Sorry, I couldn't resist. The shotgun carefully and brought it to me. We entered the house and made our way to the foot of the stairs. As we stepped slowly and carefully, we heard creaks in the floorboards above our heads. Lacy clearly smelled something she didn't like. Wait, if she could smell them, they could smell us, I realized frantically. Lacy was ahead of me and had crouched just out of sight of the stairs. I raised the shotgun and pointed the business end towards the foot of the stairs. I heard a pair of thumps from something heavy that struck the upstairs floorboards, then a tremendous crunch as the enormous figure of the werewolf, Drew Elbert, landed at the foot of my stairs. He jumped the entire length. He pivoted towards us, and I blasted him with a 3-inch slug directly in his chest. Lacy had known to wait for me to do that. As soon as the heavy projectile struck him, Lacy leapt, confident that I would have her back. She expected the other beast to jump her from behind. She was mostly right. From upstairs there was a light crumping noise, followed immediately by a roar of rage and pain that burst forth and resounded throughout the structure. I heard a feminine voice shout, "Y'all like that, bitch? When you're part animal, you don't mess with a vet." Miriam. She'd used the grenade. She would need immediate help. I raced up the stairs in time to see Nancy Elbert's werewolf ripping through my bedroom door, splinters flying in all directions. I caught up to her. She stepped through into the room. I fired once and grazed her along her back. Between the cacophony of the hound versus wolf fight downstairs and the screaming of the big bad bitch in front of me and the shotgun rounds, I was all but deaf with tinnitus. Then I began to cough, and my eyes watered from the remnants of pepper spray. Nancy shrugged off the light wound on her back and stepped forward into the room, still intent on her prey. Perhaps she meant to hold Miriam as a hostage, or to hurt her to torment me. Miriam had dived to the other side of the bed and pulled the heavy mattress over just a little to shield herself. It meant that I had a clear lane of fire. So I did. I pumped 2 rounds into Nancy's monster back. Then she spun around, claws outstretched. I put one into her face, into her left eye. There was a satisfying spray of chunks and mist from behind her head, and she dropped like the pile of crap she was. I raced over to find Miriam peeking from the corner of the mattress. I pulled her to her feet, and we embraced briefly. Then I remembered Lacy. I clawed open the bedside drawer and fumbled out 2 more rifled slugs. I'd placed stashes of the things all over the house after the howling incident. At the top of the stairs, I paused. I realized that I no longer heard the crashing and splintering or the roaring and snarling of the monster dogfight on the first floor. I descended slowly and looked cautiously around as far as I could see. Sharp cracks of rapid-fire reports further punished my ears. They were followed quickly by roars of a large-caliber pistol. After about a dozen rounds, the blasts of sound were followed by silence, or perhaps I'd completely lost my hearing. I called out, "I'm coming down and I'm carrying my shotgun. Don't shoot, please." At the bottom of the stairs, I saw a sheriff's deputy lying supine on the floor, still grasping his pistol and breathing heavily in obvious shock and fear. Just above his head stood the sheriff himself, one Gene Cloud, panting just as heavily and still clutching his rifle. Before them, stretched out with limp finality, lay the enormous corpse of the werewolf, Drew Elbert. A blurry shadow occluded my eyesight for a moment, followed by a warm, wet tongue that lapped my face with slimy dog drool, along with a disgusting smell. Lacy. After he wrapped up with the game warden investigator, Sheriff Cloud had headed out our way to check on the deputy assigned to watch my house. Deputy Knox had been out on a call when Nancy and Drew arrived. Miriam said that she had felt sorry for Lacy and sent her out to hunt after she arrived. Miriam had been upstairs when the Elberts arrived. She'd hidden, and they'd quickly cornered her in the bedroom. Yet they hadn't attacked immediately. They clearly planned a trap. Val's call had received immediate priority, and the entire mess converged and took place in the Battle of the Brooks place. The house was cleaned once more. I had to answer awkward questions from my insurance agent about the continued assault on my front door. Lacy was healing from her fresh wounds. She'd developed an impressive array of scars. She'd been holding her own with Drew despite his enormous size. Apparently fat werewolves lacked endurance, and a 12-gauge slug through one of the lungs didn't help. Sheriff Cloud had fended off the game warden's office with some convincing photos. The investigator hadn't given the case much credence in the first place, so he was happy to clear it. Now Jean sat on my back porch, next to a glass of my famous iced tea, and scratched Lacy behind the ears. "You sure would make a fine canine officer, Ms. Lacy, if you ever decide you want a career in law enforcement." She grinned up at him, and he waved his hand in front of his nose. "But we'll have to discuss our policy on oral hygiene, young lady." Deputy Knox was there. He was still a little shy of Lacy, but he was happy enough to talk with Val and Julie. Sometimes it was interesting to have a spare woman at a gathering. Valerie had sold her family home. She'd soon be leaving, but we'd assured her that she was always welcome to visit. I finally got to meet Miriam's daughter and grandson. Both women were divorced, but Jacob, Teresa's son, was a nice kid, and we hit it off. He couldn't take his eyes off Lacy, or Val, or Julie's. He was, after all, 13. Miriam and I had decided that we would all need to know the story since we were a family. She was all but moved into my house, so we had plenty to discuss. Later that evening, as the sun went down, I sang my old song to Miriam and tried to fight off a troubling thought. No one had found a sign of Peter Barnum. He'd apparently dropped off the face of the earth. It was over 100 miles to the city trauma hospital, but he had family ties in the area. Then, far off in the distance, my now recovered hearing detected a hunting howl. So quoth this raven. I said, Georgia, Georgia, a song of you comes as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines. Lacy in the Moonlight, the third part of the trilogy, by bearLair64. I was never too fond of hunting, so I sang inside my head. I had no moral obligation to the hunt. It just wasn't my thing. It involved getting up early, going out into the cold, and stumbling into the woods that I couldn't see to enjoy, then sitting and waiting or wandering along specific paths. Lots of trouble for some version when I didn't care for the taste that much. Deer has become scarce around my place since Lacy has been transformed. They used to wander right up into the yard, Now they were all but gone. I can't say that I blame them. I chuckled internally as those thoughts replaced the old Ray Charles tune. However, I wanted to do something fun with Lacy. She had been visiting the house, and I thought it would be good to spend time with her in her world. If I stayed at it, I'd end up being the world's foremost expert on Dogman. Not that I could tell anybody. They'd say I was a, wait for it, lunatic. Another internal chuckle. I was in an ebullient mood, despite where I was and what I was doing. It must have been the company. Just in time for dawn, the lead doe stepped into range to scout for the rest. She walked by cautiously, but I was downwind in a tree stand, so no problem. I waited for the next potential. There he was, a young buck, nice and tender, and legal. As soon as I fired and the unfortunate animal jumped in pain and startled, I heard the rush from behind me. A heavy carnivore poured past the base of the tree, and before the prey could jump, run, or fall, there was a splash of blood, a tumbling blur of fur, claws, hooves, and antlers that rolled over the forest floor and ended up with a decidedly deceased cervidae lying still on the loam, with Lacy crouched over the fresh-made corpse in a defensive posture, protecting our kill. The rest of the herd had long since scattered and fled for their lives. My little girl rose and howled in triumph and warning. "This is my kill. If you think you can, come and take it. Otherwise, wait your turn." Once I saw that look leave her eyes and the glowing turned back to mere reddish, I dared to speak. "You know, I could just as well be the one who howls. It was standing there dying when you finally showed yourself." Lacy gave me a dubious look that communicated, "Yeah, right." I slung my piece and began to carefully clamber down the ladder. The old pains had faded but not vanished. Only so much a body could do with bone on bone in the knees and lumbar discs out of place. I thought Lacy could hear the creaks and groans and pops in my joints. It hadn't stopped her from ripping open the belly of the deer to get at the lovely, wet, warm innards. I didn't watch. I could handle the sight and even the sounds and smells of her method of eating, but I didn't want to stare. Felt voyeuristic in some way. She didn't enjoy the smell of my cooked food either. Only fair. "You gonna save me a little backstrap?" I asked, sounding more hopeful than I felt, though that was the best part of the critter to my mind. Edible, even tasty if prepared properly. She looked up briefly, muzzle covered in gore and goblets of flesh. That face! Then she smiled and nodded. "Of course, Dad." She didn't actually say that, but we'd begun to understand one another's language. Eerie, but what should I expect from my pet monster? Or was that monster pet? I cut off my portion of the kill, as any good alpha would, and took it back to the house. I told her I'd be back shortly, and I was. By then she'd eaten what she'd wanted and hidden the rest. We were both a little logy, with her with a fresh meal and me with lack of sleep. It was frosty that morning, but there hadn't been a hard freeze. We found a little clearing with some sunlight and soft grass, and stretched out to nap. I felt like a true wild man and his dog, on the hunt, now resting and enjoying the aftermath. "Come and meet the latest member of our team," Tom Knox called to me from the open window of his patrol SUV, complete with its new canine logos. He stepped out and then called to a figure that had been partially concealed by the tinted windows of the vehicle. A shadowy mass with hints of fuzz soon became an energetic blur of bronze-colored fur that came quickly to heel. Earl Brooks, meet Oscar, K9. Oscar, a Belgian Malinois, looked up at me eagerly, a mix of friendliness and reserve on his features. He interrupted my panting for a quick closed-mouth gesture of professional greeting. I was getting good at reading Dogonese. I gave him a closed mouth, no teeth showing smile. Good morning, Oscar. Welcome to the force, and welcome to our town. I think you'll like Tom. He's a brave and true deputy, and we've faced tremendous terrors together. Oscar cocked his head for a moment to listen, and then gave a more friendly doggy grin. So, Sheriff Cloud wasn't just kidding when he spoke about a canine unit. Scoundrel never told me. Knox grinned in turn. Yes, sir, he wanted to surprise you. And Lacy. Not sure she'd like Oscar, and based on the way other dogs and hounds behave around her species, I think the feeling would be mutual. Never know, though. They are related. At least they were. I don't know. It gets confusing. I agreed with the young man, and we chatted for a while. He put Oscar back in the SUV. The working dog paused, clearly alerted to something in the line of trees. He huffed and growled a little, legs stiff, and the hair along his back and neck roughed out to make him appear larger and to deny a grip to the fangs of another predator. He dipped his head and whined just a little bit, then turned and leapt into his transport. Knox just shook his head, then looked at me questioningly. I don't think so. I haven't seen her for a couple days. Always some kind of critter in those shadows, though. I looked suspiciously towards the woods. Tom nodded. His easy grin returned, and the SUV was soon a receding plume of dust. Later that evening, Lacy stopped by to check on me and relaxed while I had a glass of tea and awaited Miriam to get home from her office. Lacy had a nice bowl of cold water. So did you see the new deputy? She shook her head and flicked her chin to let me know that she'd been far out in the wilderness earlier, then looked up with interest. Well, they brought in a canine. Sharp-looking dog. His name is Oscar. She gave me the so-what look, as if the information wasn't as interesting as I thought it would be. I was a little surprised. It didn't usually take much to excite her. Looks like Knox will be the handler. Explains why he hasn't been around lately. They had to go to school. You know, plain old dogs have to learn what to do, and human handlers have to learn how to read doggish. Not every pooch can be super intelligent and have conversations. She gave me her hideous, friendly grin and huffed out a little foul breath in my direction. Whatever else, she liked hearing she was a good girl. Well, if you weren't here this morning, then something under the trees certainly had Oscar stirred. Maybe a coyote or a fox? Lacy looked away and pretended to have an itch. She was clearly hiding something from me, but it was apparently nothing serious. Fine, keep your secrets, kiddo, I thought as I re-scratched that last patch of fur that had given her an itch. The beast that had once been Pete Barnum stalked through the night-darkened forest. Those redneck wolves had attacked him, and Drew Elbert had infected him with this hideous condition. What was left of his human mind laughed a little. I'd have expected any infections to come from Nancy, skank. Regardless, he had to deal with it, and he had to watch over his family until he could figure out a way to make it better. Then he'd met that other creature. He'd heard rumors, and old Earl had told him about her, but she was magnificent to see. Lacy. That's when they first encountered one another. It was clear she'd stalked him, and something in her smell or appearance made his hackles rise. They were natural enemies. He knew that at the most visceral level. Yet she'd taken pity on him, and since he knew that she had been Earl's treasured pet, well, it led to a truce. and for a time there was a peace between apex predators in the forest of fear. Now he stalked a different prey, not the feral hogs that were so abundant and on which he enjoyed feasting. There would be no blood at the end of this hunt. He watched over his children, in this case his daughter, their youngest at age 12. She had ridden her bicycle over to her friend's home, and now the two girls sat outside, chattering in their piping voices as they sat on the porch and shared various information on their phones. He was glad to see that his baby girl had what she needed and wanted. He planned to watch her until she made it home. So he sat in the cooling shade, and his eyes slid shut as he listened and reveled in her little voice. He awakened with a start. It was nearly sundown. The girls were gone from the porch, and no, Olivia's bike was gone. She was on her own. He had to protect her. He didn't know quite from what, but his instincts told him that her safety was his responsibility. She was his cub. He raced along the wild patches and, when necessary, wound through the human structures and conveyances on all fours to catch up with her. He caught her scent and tracked her. It grew stronger, and at last there she was. She still had her bike, but she was not riding. Just a short way from home, she stood, holding the handlebars as she spoke to a trio of older girls. These girls were too old to be her friends. Then he noted a vehicle that approached slowly down the street. It was familiar. Police. Yes, that's what it was. Then he got a scent that he did not expect. He had become a terror to the local dog population, yet this one was different. It was part of the police unit. He recognized the officer as Tom Knox. Good young man. He'd keep Olivia safe. He relaxed a little and even considered receding back into the forest. But then that dog. It began to bark insanely, clearly alerted to him. He sought the shadows, but it did no good. Most dogs feared him, but this one barked and was fierce in its own way. I would shred him in seconds and make a meal of him, but he would try. Brave and silly. He must be young. Officer Knox slowed his SUV to a stop near the four girls. He, of course, knew Olivia and had encountered the others around the area. He was sure he knew their families. "Good evening, ladies," he waved all the while. Oscar continued to bark and snarl insanely. "Ms. Olivia, I was on the way to your place. Wanted to introduce you and your brothers and your mom to our newest officer. Not sure what has him so stirred up. Oscar, quiet!" It worked for a grand total of 2 seconds, and then the working dog started in again with the growls and whines that quickly turned back into barks. "I'll take him on to your house. See you soon." He eyed the 3 older girls, who had each backed steadily away from the canine vehicle. They made quick goodbyes and walked back down the street. Olivia followed Officer Knox and his ferocious charge the rest of the way to their home. The shadow that had watched them faded back and disappeared into the woods. Miriam had apparently enjoyed the supper I'd prepared, and now the dishes were done. We spooned on the couch and watched the mindless drivel on the big screen. Not sure why I'd bought the thing. I hardly watch it. I mainly used it to watch movies. However, my grown-up girl liked it, so I hadn't thrown anything at it lately. Teresa and Jacob are coming down for the long weekend. They really took a shine to you. And of course, Jacob is infatuated with Lacy. In a healthy way, she quickly added to intercept the smart aleck comment she knew I'd make. What kid wouldn't love a friendly dog man? I grinned to myself. The quip about unhealthy love interest had crossed my mind, but I'd never intended to give voice to it. I loved her after a fashion, and I liked the kid. He was smart and energetic in a non-destructive way. So can they stay for the entire holiday? Maybe we can invite some other folks over on Saturday. Let them have a shop on Friday. I don't know many kids in the area, but maybe we could invite Pete Barnum's brood over for a get-together. They'll have a tough time with their dad missing on Thanksgiving. Might as well keep 'em busy. She gave me a tender kiss. Earl, you are a very thoughtful man. Those kids and their mother must be pretty worried. Still no sign of poor Pete? I'm sure Seraph Cloud will take care of him on Thursday, but yes, by Saturday they will be lonely and full of heavy thoughts. Maybe we can invite Julie if she has no plans, and that nice Deputy Knox. She loved to make matches. She'd have hopes for Valerie and some poor fellow, maybe Tom, but Val was a committed city girl these days, and while we talked online, she had no plans to return to Podunk. Poor Julie still lived close, though, and she and Knox seemed to get along well. They were about the same age, and both worked weird shifts. They'd understand one another. Those poor kids. Miriam Stone was a determined woman. Tom drove back down the street from Pete Barnum's place. Oscar had recovered himself and was once again seated in the back, panting with a gape-mouthed grin and alternating between alertness and trying to catch a dog nap. Pete's kids had been enthralled with the new member of their dad's department. They were good kids, and the elder boy, PJ, wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. Pete hadn't wanted that, but he knew better than to directly oppose a teenage boy. Well, Big O, did you like Pete's young'uns? Oscar licked his chops and snapped his mouth shut, then went back to his happy panting. Tom grinned in turn and shook his head. Thanks, buddy. It would mean a lot to Pete to know that we checked in on him. He had it in mind to check out where the other 3 girls had gone. If they'd stayed on track, they'd soon have juvie files. And he didn't want them trying to drag down Olivia or just hurt her because her dad was a peace officer. It was now past dark, and they should be headed home, but none of them had parents who would be there or care whether they did homework, ate, or in any way took care of themselves. Job security, he said to himself ruefully. He turned off his headlights as he approached the little park with its one swing set and a few picnic tables. He rolled down the window. Yep, the stench of tobacco smoke and wonderful ganja. He looked around into the poor-lit area, and there they were, all lined up at the picnic table. He put on his game face and alerted his partner. All right, buddy, time to earn your kibble. Your first big small-town case. He turned off the road and onto the grass. Odd, all 3 of the girls were looking out into the darkness of a patch of woods, probably hallucinating or pretending to. He activated his emergency lights as the girls turned to run towards him. They screamed, and the high-pitched tones blended appallingly with the deep-throated roar of anger. A titanic black shadow thundered from the forest in pursuit. As 2 of the girls looked back over their shoulder, it rose to its hind legs. Crap! Another werewolf! His mind screamed as the 3 delinquents ran past his patrol car. His training took over, and he hit the automatic window button for the back area so his new partner could join him. He stepped out and drew his sidearm, and for the second time in his life, sought to kill a werewolf. This time, however, the beast in question was not wounded and understood the threat that the firearm posed. With a quick and contemptuous slash of its claws, it swiped the pistol from its grip and left a pair of long, raking wounds on the inside of his right forearm. One of the gouges immediately fountained and started pumping out the young deputy's lifeblood. That was when Oscar overrode his fear and leapt from the patrol unit. He closed quickly on the monstrous form and sunk his teeth into the werewolf's arm, even as it drew back from striking Oscar's partner, his packmate. One good wound deserved another, yet size and power mattered in a fight, and the monster clamped its own enormous jaws onto Oscar's neck, which forced the loyal dog to release his grip. The werewolf slung him about a few times and then spat him contemptuously at Knox's feet. It stepped forward and raised its hand for another strike. The smell of the two-legged Knox thing drove his insane and dreadful hunger, and the piteous whimpers of his canine attacker stirred instincts to vanquish the foe, to remove the threat from his world. Yet it paused, stood and quavered, engaged in a war between opposing instincts. It knew on some level where Barnum still lived that this was wrong. It should not consume the flesh of the two legs. Oh, but the hunger gnawed at his mind and his belly. With a pained growl of anger and confusion, the creature stepped back. Then it turned and fled into the night. Knox hadn't noticed the tableau that unfolded underneath the looming shadow the monster had cast over him. He was very busy tightening and locking down the tourniquet he'd made from his duty belt. Good thing Sheriff Cloud's a tactical thinker, he thought gratefully. He had gotten them for the entire department after the last Elbert incident, and they'd practiced using them on themselves and each other. Oscar whined a little in obvious pain. His own wounds leaked blood and his eyes remained closed tight. "I got this, buddy," Knox said tightly, then used his radio to contact dispatch and get some help on the way. Maybe Julie will show. I kind of like her. His thoughts trailed off as he fought to maintain consciousness. The beast that had been Deputy Barnum ran swiftly through the small patches of trees towards the more extensive woods at the edge of town. He'd only meant to frighten those little turds, but when they screamed and ran, his new nature rose to the forefront, and he gave chase. All pretense of any motive but hunger gone as the monster subsumed the man. Now he was frightened by what he'd done, afraid of how he would act around his family. He couldn't hurt them. He couldn't risk what would happen if one of them did something to trigger his baser instincts. Jean Cloud sat and brooded in worry about his deputy and friend. He'd suspected for a while what had happened to Pete. Barnum had been on duty the night Lacy Elbert slaughtered and at least partially devoured her parents. She'd been full, having recently devoured her boyfriend, Phil Lefevre, as though he were a large order of French fries. Barnum had possessed the presence of mind to call him directly, so that only those two and J.P. had any idea of what the scene looked like. They'd put together a team to clean the scene, and while they processed it legally, he'd done everything he could to keep the details of how far it had gone from becoming public knowledge. Lacy Elbert was a piece of work, but nowhere near the low-life trash that her cousins had been. The sheriff's department had handled those two on several occasions, and they'd fought every single time, especially Nancy. He couldn't picture Lacy eating her boyfriend and parents alone. Maybe she'd had help from her scuzzy cousins. It had to be the nature of the beasts. He'd studied wares since then and believed that something in their nature subsumed whatever remained of their humanity when it came to feeding time. Phil had been good to and for Lacy Elbert, yet she shredded him and devoured the meat from his corpse first. It was said in some circles that werewolves always ended up hurting those they had loved the most. Part of a curse or something? He didn't buy that, but he believed strongly in the psychological harm that would come from the trauma of such a dramatic shift in the physical and instinctive nature of a person. Now his friend Pete Barnum had gone through a similar transformation into, he wasn't sure what. His radio squawked and startled him from his reverie. He was soon on the way to the scene in fear for another of his deputies, Tom Knox. The monster situation was growing out of his control. I drove up to the office with Dr. Stone. The emergency call was about Oscar, the new canine officer. He had been mauled by an animal and was in pretty bad shape. The deputy who brought him into the emergency clinic sounded pretty shaken. Miriam had the call on speaker, and we could both tell that she was unsure how to react. "Deb will be there in a few minutes. Nobody to stop us from speeding, but if there's a ticket, give it to Earl. He's driving." I smiled tightly and briefly. Miriam was pretty steady under stress. After all, she'd thrown a grenade at a werewolf. She was stressed herself, but used humor to break the tension for both she and Deputy Rosharon. She was all but out the door before I came to a complete stop and dashed to the clinic doors, keys at the ready. I would have offered to help the deputy carry the poor canine into the clinic, but she had a good handle on him. She was a stout woman, a part-timer. I had a momentary flashback at the sight of the blood-stained and very limp dog in the arms of a blood-smeared, frightened, concerned human. It was so similar to what happened with Lacy. But Oscar's head dangled and his tongue lolled, and his eyes were slitted and glassy with pain and shock. He was more seriously injured than my girl had been. I held the door for the deputies after they and Miriam were all in the examination room. I started a pot of coffee. Dr. Stone had no need to order her orderly to do that anymore. As I puttered about the front of the office, I heard Deputy Rosharon use her radio to contact Jean. "Yes, sir. He's at the clinic. Doc's working on stabilizing him. Any word on Knox?" Jean's voice came through with just a little electronic fuzz. "He's on his way to the ER. Paramedic says it looked like the tourniquet worked. Big concern now is shock." There was a slight pause. "I'm still on scene. If you're clear, head my way. And bring Earl and his shotgun." Lacy noted that scent, oddly familiar from one of her earliest memories. She'd watched as the Elbert twins left her behind at the store, alone, abandoned, frightened, and in pain, yet relieved that the two monsters were getting farther away from her with every step. Better alone than with them. She still eyed them warily, afraid they'd turn back towards her. Then an immense creature stepped from just inside the woodline. It moved almost silently and exuded a tremendous odor. The two-legged bitch that turned towards the foul smell just in time to get bitten on the shoulder. The two-legged male turned and saw the danger, too late to do more than just raise his thick arm to protect himself. The old one had bitten him before he could even manage a scream of fear. He shook and tugged at the arm a little, and as both of the evil humans fell to the ground in fear and pain, he'd let go and turned towards Lacy. She beat a little and shrank back in terror, but the large, old dog-man simply favored her with an evil grin, and then leapt back into the shadows of the trees. He'd been in the area on his migration track and had observed how the Elberts had treated the poor puppy. A creature much like he'd once been, though both of his parents had already been dogmen when he was born. Some were born, some were turned, but these human creatures would now become the enemy. The monsters that he reveled in chasing, fighting, and killing. Maybe the pup would get them before he returned to these woods. She and her pack had indeed gotten them before he'd returned. and this time she knew of his presence before he knew of hers. She knew his nature and no longer feared him much. He was still much larger than she, and there was something wild about him that she lacked. She let out a low bark and a huff towards his location, and directly she was rewarded by the sight of her old rescuer as he peered through a spray of dead leaves in the autumn forest. When he realized she'd spotted him, he burst through the remaining screen of vegetation and rose up to his full height in challenge and greeting. Jean greeted Deputy Rocherin and me when we arrived at the park. We all carried lights and long guns. It took us a while to get Deb on board with the fact that we were about to embark on a monster hunt. It just wasn't her purview. Sheriff Cloud hadn't wanted word to spread, but he was getting short on deputies who already knew. He'd have to trust her. He already did to a large degree. He wouldn't have hired her and kept her on for most of the past decade if he hadn't. But this was the kind of information that got licenses pulled for mental instability. "Look," he said, "I don't really want to wade into those trees after dark. But it's been an hour or so since the attack. Good chance he's moved out of the area, but there's too many homes around the park to make assumptions. He left a pretty clear trail. We'll follow it until we either catch up to him or ensure that he's left the area. Earl, this has to be strictly voluntary on your part. Are you okay with it?" "Yes, but Miriam, Dr. Stone says that if you get me hurt or killed, you'll have to settle with her." I grinned humorlessly. He nodded, and we got underway on the hideously dangerous nighttime stalk. Pete Barnum, Beast, rushed deep into the woods, at first heedlessly of direction, shifting this way and that on the path of least resistance. The hunger raged within him. It gnawed his innards and his mind and tattered his sensibilities. He barreled ahead once more, burning away as much of the feeling as he could manage with the effort, when he barged into a sounder of feral hogs. He was among them before either him or they realized. An enormous boar, alert and on guard, charged him, and the two collided in a brief but savage battle. The porcine male tore at him with its tusks as it sped past him. He'd gracefully sidestepped and raked his claws along its back. It spun and gaped and attempted to bite him, but he wrapped its ugly head in his arms and lifted it to his fang-filled maw. The satisfying crunch and subsequent flow of gore into his mouth and gullet thrilled him. His fellow monster squealed and grunted and thrashed to no avail. He shifted his grip and raised the 400 pounds of pork above his head, then dashed it against a tree, spine first. He heard the satisfying crack, and squeals subsided to pained whines and snorts. He threw back his head and howled in triumph and challenge. He was going to feed after all, and his family was safe from his potential depredation. After a quick look around and a few sniffs of the prevailing breeze, he set to work on the feast before him. There was plenty to fill the void within him, to rend, gulp, and gobble to his heart's content. Lacy and the old one stalked the trail of the enemy. She tried to convince him that this one was different, safe. Unfortunately, their language was very direct, not complex, and held few nuances. The old one had scoffed and tried to make her understand that it was not a matter of whom the creature had been, but what it was now. In any case, they would find him and decide from there what to do. They shifted their pathway as much as possible to stay downwind from where the trail led. No guarantees, but it was at least a basic tactic. As they ranged forward, an intense and very loud howl emanated from the trail ahead. The sound was very near and accompanied by the smell of blood. A tremendous rustle of the underbrush and dried leaves drew close, and the sounder of feral hogs rushed past in genuine panic. The dogman stepped aside and let the panicked animals proceed into the forest. Lacy, as much as her nature allowed, was relieved. She knew that the monster had not yet taken a human life. That would have led to more problems for her and the old one, and any creature of a similar build. They separated and approached the feasting monstrosity as quietly as possible. Its back was to them in the light of the waning but still gibbous and bright moon. It slobbered and munched in evident ecstasy of blood-craving satisfied. She paused, intent on letting it finish its repast before she approached. It would be calm, even low-key, after such a large meal, perhaps willing to listen to threats since it was outnumbered. With a roar, the old one burst from hiding and sprang upon the back of the werewolf, even as it raised its chin to gulp down yet another goblet of bloody flesh. The two tumbled and rolled in the now small clearing. The brush and smaller trees had been trampled somewhat by the feeding sounder, and then by the strife between hunter and prey. Now it was home to a death match between two enormous brutes that roared and bit and clawed at one another as they rolled around the forest floor. Their speed made their movements a blur as each struggled to gain a killing hold on the other. Lacy wanted desperately to help, but there was no room for her. The old one hadn't waited long enough to give her a chance to run in and be a distraction, and perhaps cause some damage while he prepared a sneak attack as pack dogs would do. A very doggish plan, but apparently not the way true-born dogmen did things. She hovered, prepared to strike, should an opportunity present itself. It did not, but there was no need. The old one managed to get a fang into one of Pete's jugular, since it had been up and exposed as he swallowed his prey. A screech yowled in mortal pain and fear. Every living thing fears death, even monsters. His hunger sated and the battle lost, he faded into warm thoughts of his family. He'd protected them. Those girls would be too terrified to leave their homes, much less bother his Olivia. But mostly he'd protected them from himself, from what he'd become. Sheriff Cloud came to an immediate halt as his eyes caught the red shine and twin glow ahead. He raised his rifle but paused. I was there beside him, equally paused. We studied the creature for a brief instant and realized it was not a werewolf, but a dogman. Then the sharp reports of Deputy Rocheron's rifle barked out, and flames burst from her barrel as she unloaded on what she saw as a monster ahead of her. She'd already changed her magazine before Jean could get her to stop and focus again. Meantime, I ran ahead towards the fallen form of Lacy. Too big. Then what? About that time I was engulfed in a hot, furry embrace and brushed aside to avoid any further danger from the deputy. I thumped soundly on the ground, and the air was driven from my lungs. I gulped in to replace it. I caught the foul, oh so welcome, disgusting breath of my girl. It didn't take long to confirm that the enormous beasts, had been Pete Barnum. The additional skin and fur sloughed from his pitiful remains, even as we watched in shock and sadness. The other creature simply melted along with him, but no dog emerged. It remained what it was, a mystery being. Lucy knew, but wouldn't be able to tell us. Some things would have to remain a mystery to we mere humans. It was a while before we had any celebrations. Pete's family was devastated. Knox recovered and became quite vigorous. He and Julie perched once more on my front porch, this time with their sides melding together, and she traced the apparent fascinating and wounded scars on his forearm. Miriam's mission had been accomplished without her interference, though she somehow managed to take credit. Couldn't possibly be that the man had stood his ground with yet another werewolf, and that Julie had been largely responsible for saving his life. Never a stress bond. Had to be because of something that Miriam Stone said or did, or at least wished. This party was a send-off for Pete Jr., PJ. He was headed off for military service to get college money. There was no stopping him. He was bound and determined to be just like his father, a very worthy and honorable goal. Debbie was there with her husband, Glenn. She'd decided it was time to hang up the belt and badge, and now worked as an EMT on Julie's crew. Jacob and the twin Dogman pups played a game of tireless tag by way of the old doggy door through which Lacy would never fit again. She eyed her pups and the two-legged youngster with the wary caution of a new mother. Teresa watched her own child, young man, closely as well. Everyone was getting along, but any misunderstandings or falsely triggered instincts could result in unfortunate events. Oscar, who now towered above me as he stood and listened to the conversation between Jean and I, glanced at their pups and then at Lacy. They caught one another's eye, and Lacy grinned first. It would be fine. Kids would be kids, and we're all family after all. Author's note. Oscar was a real Belgian Malinois. His handler and I were friends, and he was friends with my Rottweiler, Pasha. When Oscar first arrived at our post in Germany, he was an unknown quantity. No one had ever worked with him, so naturally, I volunteered to be the first to catch him during aggression training. There's an opening in the bite sleeve so that the decoy can bend his or her arm. Oscar did something unusual, though. Most dogs would come in low, and the decoy would crouch and lean into their bites. Oscar leapt. I raised my arm and instinctively pulled back my face. That thing was bad enough without any dog bites. With my arm straight, the opening left of the inside of my elbow uncovered. He hooked a tooth into that opening. He pulled the brachial artery offline, but didn't tear it. Still, I had a nice big hole in my arm. Fortunately, we were near Landstuhl Army Hospital. When I healed, the scar looked like the space shuttle in profile, at least to me. A few months later, we had the Challenger disaster, so it meant something at the time. I caught Oscar one more time. Had to prove to the kennel master that I hadn't lost it. It's tradition. After that, I ended up as his secondary handler for a couple of weeks while Kenny had to go home for a family emergency. Oscar and Pasha and a German shepherd named Elkin became our demonstration team. They and we worked as a pack. We traveled around and presented information about the dogs and handling, etc. Oscar's famous snake trick created a stir. Kenny would yell, "Snake!" and Oscar would jump into my arms. Not sure the army would approve, but that was so long ago. Any failures in description are mine, but I do speak fluent dogginese and doggish. So quoth this raven. Thank you so much, my darlings, for coming to visit me. It's always nice to have you in my chateau. It means so much to me that you would spend your time listening to me. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, to Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams. Good night, my darlings.